Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Those participants who are in Greater Minnesota are turning on their broadcasts now, so we need to take advantage of every minute we've got. My name is Judy Myers, and I'm the coordinator for Lessons from the Field, and I want to welcome everybody here today, both here in McNamara and at over 25 sites in Greater Minnesota. So altogether, we have close to 380 people participating today from lots of different places. I want to draw your attention to just a few things before we start. We have 6 presenters today, and they all wanted to ensure that everybody has plenty of opportunity to ask questions. So we've planned 3.5 Q&As during the morning. There will be a Q&A after each 2 presenters, and you have several ways to submit questions. For those people in Greater Minnesota, you can send your questions to cmh@umn.edu, and Jessica will retrieve those questions and submit those to Ann Gearity, who's going to facilitate the Q&As. For those of you who are here in McNamara, you can either write your questions down on paper that we provided in your folders, and if you need more paper, we've got index cards to distribute. And we'll also have 2 handheld mics that some of our volunteers will be making available to you. So please don't hesitate if you have questions during those times to ask them. I also want to remind you that we have evaluation surveys in your folders. I think when I was sitting on that side of the podium, I didn't fully appreciate how much those evaluation surveys mean to the people who are coordinating these kinds of events. We take them very seriously, so please take a few minutes before you leave to complete your evaluation surveys. You can hand them in at the registration desk, and in return, we will give you CEUs for being here today. So I'm going to introduce Ann Gearity, who is known to probably 90% of you in here today. She has been engaged in long-time work with and on behalf of children and youth. She authored Developmental Repair, a training manual, a number of years ago. And though it's designed for a treatment model for young children, it's applicable to children of all ages and in many different settings. Today, Ann is going to talk about Stuart Hauser's work. He was a researcher at Harvard for many years. He is now deceased. But reading an obituary that a friend wrote, he must have been a pretty phenomenal person. She's going to talk about his research and how it helps to frame our work with adolescents. And then her comments will provide further context for the other 5 people who will speak after her presentation. So I give you Ann Gearity.
Wow, I feel like a rock star. Thank you very much, Judy, and I'm delighted to be here. 2 thoughts before I start with my work. We described this when this program started as Lessons from the Field for the Field. So I'm really delighted that we have such an extraordinary panel who are all doing work that you and the audience are doing. And the question and answer, hopefully, is to just keep pushing our practices so that we get more and more effective and efficient and satisfied. The second is, Stuart was a dear friend and mentor. He worked with me on developmental repair, and he and his colleague Joe Allen, who is also an extraordinary man down at the University of Virginia, wrote this book. Stuart wrote the book after 40 years of longitudinal research with following teens. He got involved with my developmental repair project and really helped me see that what I was trying to develop was a project about resilience And that word you're going to hear a lot about today, resilience. We can't change children's pasts, but we can influence their capacity to have a present and a future. So we're going to think about that word and go ahead. Now, let me see. Okay. So we want to start by thinking about teenagers, and I'm just going to introduce some ideas and then look to our panel members to expand them. So all children are vulnerable to immediate and ongoing effects of trauma, and we've described this workshop as working with challenging teens. Teens, given their emerging developmental resources, have some internal protections, but are also at greater risk if they are challenging to their families and communities. So we're thinking about how teens need the help of others and what happens when others abandon them or get discouraged by them. Many of us were not totally happy as teens, probably, but we remember the people who either put us down or built us up. All right? In adolescence, so we want to think of other risks to adolescence. In adolescence, there are also self-risks. Risks and protectors can often be one and the same. Hormones is both a risk and a protection. What makes teens challenging is their ability or lack of ability to see their own possibilities. By definition, adolescence has to be a challenging time, given the rapid change in body and mind, as well as the increasing demands and expectations from the social world that they adapt to an increasingly complex social world and embrace social norms. So the teen is both struggling with inside changes that are rapid and often dysregulating, but also outside changes. You know, and we saw this recently with a Supreme Court case deciding whether 14-year-olds can be held liable for murder for their entire lives. You know, at the same time that we have lots of families that see 14-year-olds as hardly able to, you know, make it across the street and down the block. So we have a lot of ambivalence about what is adolescence and what should they be expected to do. Trauma, so we're going to use trauma as a general overriding idea about challenging. Now, trauma is always defined as an event from the outside that disrupts the child's capacity to cope. Some of the teams we work with have had very discrete traumas, very definable traumas. Others have had lives that are filled with cumulative and disrupting traumas. So we want to think of the word broadly. All teenagers have to struggle with stress. All right? So we're not saying life should be stressless, but what we are saying is that stress is useful when it allows teens to learn. It becomes problematic when it is toxic. And I define toxic stress as too much for too long with too little adult mediation. So again, you see the inside-outside balance that we're looking for. Teens with a history of trauma often tried to manage trauma by taking charge. Remember, we define trauma as disrupting your capacity to feel effective or in power of your own lives. So teens often try to manage trauma by taking charge of their own lives. This is a positive effort, but trauma often robs them of the necessary capacities to make this work. So again, can you feel the push-pull? It's protective to take charge of your life, but it becomes a risk when you don't have the cognitive ability or problem-solving resources to do it well. So we're thinking of this push-pull. Right? The teens that we're going to be talking about today have struggled with adversity. Many have lost the chance to transition easily into adulthood. Right? They've already carried so much stress that the move into adulthood would be an effortful process. Interventions cannot change their path, but we may be able to better prepare them to embrace and use their future. To set the frame for this discussion, I want to offer these 3 protections that the research of Hauser and Allen have identified as predicting resilience. So let me tell you about their studies. And I cited their book. It's Out of the Woods, Tales of Resilient Teens. And what they did was they started in the late 60s, and they looked at teens identified as at risk. And at the time, they were in a psychiatric hospital. So what they did not do was go backwards and say, let's evaluate all their risks. They said, let's go forward. Let's assume that they're at risk, and let's see what they do with their lives. And they followed them for almost 40 years, and they had a 97% compliance rate. So they followed these kids up and down and in and out of towns and countries, and they did mostly quantitative research, but each interview had a qualitative component. So Out of the Woods, they went back and looked at the narratives, and they tried to think about what were in the narratives of 13 teens that they identified over this 40-year period as being resilient. Now, the first thing, before I go to the protections that they found that was so important to my work, was that resilience is not constant. We're not talking about a projection that goes up and keeps going. We're not talking about kids who got out of adolescence and had stress-free lives. We're talking about a quality that often waxes and wanes. We're talking about, less the ability to make everything work and more the ability to manage when it doesn't work so that it can work again. Now, this is really important with our work with adolescents because we have to help them not feel like they've got it made, but that they can keep making it. So when they got knocked over, they can get back up and move forward. That's really what resilience is. Now, their research, Stuart and Joe's research, identified these three qualities in the narrative that they found dominated the resilient teens' narratives and were absent in the not resilient teen. So I want to talk about them and suggest that we keep them in mind as we see these intervention focuses that our panelists are going to talk about. The three are agency and a quest for mastery. The second is reflective capacity, looking inward. And the third is caring about relationships. All right? So quickly. And these quotes are from their book. I didn't cite each slide. Agency and a quest for mastery. These teens believe they can influence their environment. All right, it's like being the agent of the baseball player. You make things happen. They had an optimistic bias. They inspired confidence, but also softened the inevitable failures and setbacks that accompany any bold course. So that was their bias. And they were active agents in their own lives. And they described it as this: how a resilient process may be operating powerfully underneath exactly the kind of behavior that would most seem to controvert it. Now, this is important because I think a lot of times those who don't think about resilience see teens' behavior as bad or maladaptive, when that very maladaptive behavior might have in it the energy and determination to make it adaptive. All right, I'll give you another example. In early adolescence, teens are notoriously physical. All right, you go into any junior high and they're touching each other all the time. This is a sense of agency. Where are you? Where am I? How do we negotiate space? Many programs for young adolescent children who have been disruptive in the community have a rule: no touch. Right? So we're inhibiting a normative agency process that has value, right? And decreasing children's ability to use. Or we interpret through our lens one meaning of a behavior instead of seeing multiple meanings. So we want to think about agency. How do we keep these kids active? Right? How do we not nail them under our thumbs, but keep them thinking about their own energy and power? The second is reflective capacity and narrative. Reflection is more than just noticing what one feels. It's an effort to make sense of feelings. It is the ability to think about one's thought processes. They observe what's going on in their heads. The resilient kids suspect early that the inner life requires as much skill as the external environment. They make active efforts to learn how to manage it. When the resilient kids get scared, they hone their survival skills. They don't waste much effort hoping to escape the rigors of life. Right? So we want to think of this capacity for reflection. And again, how do we support it? Many times interventions tell kids what they should think instead of helping them think about what they want to tell us. The third capacity is caring about relationships. This print is very small. My eyes are getting there. Okay, resilient kids retain an interest in forming new relationships or reforming old ones that is apparently boundless, and their skills in relationships grow. But in their narratives, there is nothing one-dimensional about the earlier relationships. The vivid ambivalence of the portraits, far from discrediting them, makes them all the more intriguing. These narratives honor the complexities of real people. They lure the kids to deeper understanding. Now, this has been again documented in the AAI research. The secure or autonomous adult is not looking to candy coat their past. They have a very realistic sense of their past relationships, and in their realistic understanding, they can renegotiate these relationships. So people who harmed them as children don't stop being the narrative experience, the relationship experience it was, but they know how to keep building relationships. Now, this last part is the most important. Resilient teens don't just stumble onto better relationships than other kids do. They take themselves to where the action is. The availability of caring adults is only part of the problem. The capacity of troubled kids to make use of them is the rest. Right? So when we talk about relationship engagement, we want to again think of activity, agency, and reflection. How do you build relationships where you are actively engaging the other and negotiating and creating reciprocal experiences so that the relationships become useful? And as many of you know, in developmental repair, the first thing that we had to talk about was how do adults join these children so that they can use us. And when we talk about use, we don't mean manipulate, we don't mean endless kindness, we don't mean, chronically forgiving and supporting. We mean engaging in a way so we teach them to use us so that they learn to use themselves and others. And that's what we want to listen to. So, as we proceed with our panelists, and again, I am so grateful to Judy and Carrie for putting together this exemplary group of researchers and practitioners, we want to consider the adolescents that we're working with. So each of you take a second and think of someone. All right? Have that person in your mind, because it will help to really personalize the work. We want to find these protective, so don't worry about apply, I got ahead of myself. You just want to find these protective capacities in the different intervention and research and information. You want to listen to these ideas and consider how they may alter your work with teenagers, and together, let's leave this lessons from the field with increased clarity and confidence that teens can benefit from our support. Thank you very much. All right. So I want to get us started with our panel, and our first panelist is Dr. Monica Luciana. Luciana teaches in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota and she studies the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, the part of the adolescent brain we're so interested in. This morning, she'll discuss research about adolescent brain development that will help us better understand adolescent development and behavior. So, Monica, thank you so much.
Oh, I feel like a real shorty up here. Okay, so as Ann mentioned, my work primarily involves studying processes that are important to what we consider to be the normative development of the adolescent brain. But I come at this from a clinical psychology perspective. That's my background. And so I have an interest in trying to understand normative processes, but how those processes might help us understand what goes wrong under certain types of conditions. And so just an overview of some of the points I want to try to make today in this presentation. Well, first of all, we have to understand that trauma takes place against a backdrop of what we hope will be normative development. And so one of our challenges is to try to encourage the processes that will allow teens to move forward into a productive adulthood, even though we understand that they are dealing with adversity. And as I hope I'll convey to you, the brain, I think, is really primed in this period of the lifespan to encourage those processes that Ann just told us about. So reflective capacity, agency, and developing positive relationships, largely with peers. I mean, that's a big focus in the adolescent period, but I think these things extend into adulthood. And trauma, as best we understand it, does impact processes that are going on in the brain to encourage normal development. But the positive aspect of this is that a developing brain is considered a malleable and plastic brain. And when I say brain, of course, I'm also thinking that we're talking about behavior and then how the individual develops. So what we want to keep in mind is that this is a window of opportunity where we can intervene and actually make a difference at multiple levels. So the first take-home point then is that numerous brain-based changes are occurring during adolescence to promote efficient transfer of information and connectivity between brain regions. And I'm going to tell you about some of those changes. So first of all, I want to just highlight some of the important neurodevelopmental processes that unfold to build an adult brain. Well, the first is formation of neurons, which are brain cells. And neurons form, they travel, they migrate to their appropriate locations in the brain, and they kind of settle there. And this is a process that largely takes place prenatally and during infancy, although some very recent research is suggesting that maybe even the adult brain has the capacity to form new neurons. It's a controversial literature, but it's an exciting thing for us to think about. Once the cells, the neurons, travel to where they're supposed to be in the brain, they have to form connections with other cells because otherwise they're not really positioned to do anything. And so that's the process called synaptogenesis, the formation of functional connections between cells. And this graphic illustrates what that's about to some extent. So you have a cell, it has a fiber that emanates from it, and then from that fiber, which is called an axon, different connections, capacities for connection, let's just say, form with other cells. And so that's what the synapses are, the potential for connection. Synaptogenesis occurs most exuberantly in infancy and early childhood. And at that point in our lives, we have more synapses, more capacity for connectivity in the brain than we actually need as adulthood. And it's thought that this excess capacity allows us to take advantage of the multiple kinds of learning opportunities and experiences that occur in the childhood period. Another important process is called myelination. Myelination is where a fatty substance called myelin forms around that axon of certain nerve cells. And it looks something like this. So the function of myelin is actually to build up insulation around the axon, and then there are electrical impulses that are being conveyed down the axon, and this insulation builds up resistance so that the speed of the impulse can actually increase. So what we understand myelination to help the brain relay impulses in an increasingly fast and efficient manner. And myelination is a process that occurs throughout childhood, into adolescence, and maybe even somewhat into young adulthood. The next process that's important is called synaptic pruning. And so I mentioned to you we have this excess of synapses that forms. Well, we don't keep that extra brain capacity for our entire lives. Rather, the brain has a means of assuring that it streamlines the capacity for connectivity using the connections that we use the most. And so synaptic pruning is the elimination of unused synapses. And pruning is thought to be a particularly important process in the adolescent period because, as best we understand it, it starts to occur around the pubertal period and then extends through adolescence and into young adulthood. So the result of pruning is actually evidence of some tissue loss in the brain, which when somebody's an older adult, we tend to think of as a very bad thing, but at this younger point in life, it's a positive development. So the end result is a brain that's more streamlined in terms of its connectivity, a brain that allows faster relaying of information. And one thing I didn't mention to you is that there's variation across the brain in how this timetable unfolds, where the higher levels of the brain, the frontal lobe, for example, undergo synaptogenesis and synaptic pruning later than other regions. And that means that until that pruning process is done, those parts of the brain are increasingly plastic or malleable and open to experiential influence. So just to summarize then some of the important principles here with respect to the brain, we have this use it or lose it idea. And so you can imagine that this has both positives and negatives depending on the nature of experience. If we can introduce positive experience and allow connections to be used that are ultimately beneficial to behavior, then that's a positive thing. There's this blossoming and pruning of connections. But ultimately, connectivity is the important thing in terms of building a brain that's highly functional and can promote the kinds of behaviors that we consider to be adaptive. And then the developmental timetable is important. These processes unfold in the order that they do for a reason. And we think that part of the reason is that the brain is geared toward anticipating certain kinds of life experiences that people should have in this important time period of development. So one behavior is reflective capacity. I'm going to use the three examples of resilient behavior to structure the rest of the presentation. So we can think of this as the capacity for quiet thought, contemplation, thinking before acting, and all of these things fall under the rubric of what we define in neuroscience as executive functions. So behaviors that we think are controlled by the frontal lobe of the brain. And if you think about reflective capacity and what it might involve in terms of sub-processes, it's a complicated thing. So you have to be able to think flexibly, entertain multiple ideas in your mind, and reflect on one, shift to another. So flexibility is important. Empathy is also important. So being able to appreciate the views, not only your own internal views and your own feelings, and to reflect on those, but also this can extend to other people as well. We have to be able to think about multiple aspects of decision making. Why is one option better than another option? And then importantly, for reflection to occur, there has to be a capacity for inhibition. You have to take time to reflect and not just act in kind of a trigger-happy way to behave reflexively. So again, we think these are all frontal lobe processes, and the frontal lobe is showing quite a bit of development in the adolescent period. This graph on the right-hand side is a study that was done at the National Institute of Health, where a group of researchers followed the same group of kids over time throughout the adolescent period, and they measured aspects of their brain structure. And the blue and purpley highlighted regions in the figure show areas of the brain where there was a loss of gray matter. Gray matter is what we think of as the substrate for synapses. And one thing that you can appreciate looking at the figure is that as adolescence unfolds, there's quite a bit of loss in the cortex, the thinking part of the brain, but also in the frontal lobe in particular. And so this, again, is an active period of development for the frontal lobe that benefits these various behaviors. So frontal lobe development supports reflective capacity by encouraging behaviors such as flexibility, control, decision-making, and empathy. But, this is kind of a cognitive view in some ways. And when we think about adolescent behavior, cognition is not necessarily the first thing that comes to mind, right? At least in many cases. In fact, many of us think about teenagers more in terms of their emotional state, which is often thought to be somewhat labile. There's this tendency toward risk-taking behavior. And so we have to keep in mind it's not only cognitive systems that are developing. And I really think a neglected area in our field has been the extent to which motivational systems are also changing in this period of the lifespan. So particularly, adolescents are going through a period where approach and being drawn toward positive things is an extremely salient part of their development. And this is not just behavioral. This is reflected also in what's going on in the reward system of the brain, which recent work suggests may be in a state of almost over-exuberance in the adolescent period. And so on the plus side, this is what motivates the adolescent toward physical activity, things like involvement in sports, approach toward peers and interest in relationships, an increased sex drive, for example, wanting to engage in appetitive behaviors. So that can be a positive thing if adolescents are in the right kind of context, but it can also be a negative thing if they encounter risks like being exposed to substances like drugs or alcohol or gambling or other things that we would consider to be problematic given the age. The graph on the right-hand side of the slide illustrates for you a recent study that was done where a group had adolescents, adults, and children viewing pictures of happy faces. The faces varied in emotion. This particular graph pertains to happy faces. And what I wanted to call your attention to was the red bar in the middle. That's the adolescent data, and adolescents showed increased activity in a structure of the reward system called the nucleus accumbens when they viewed happy faces. In fact, they also tended to view neutral faces as happy faces. So it's one example of adolescents being primed to actually see the world in a more optimistic way than they might at a different point in the lifespan. And we have to keep in mind this motivation provokes action. That's the whole point of this acceleration in positive drive. We think that this is an evolutionary development that allows the adolescent to engage with new experiences, to take charge of situations, again, that are new and novel, and to develop that sense of mastery or agency that Ann referred to. So there has to be a means of assuring that this will take place for people, for the population as a whole. And this change in the reward system is what we think underlies that capacity. Well, as rewards go, I want to just reflect on this idea of relationship salience, because peers are a special source of reward for the adolescent, even more so than in adulthood and even more so than in childhood. And we know this from data about the nature of friendships in the adolescent period, but also some new research in the growing field called social neuroscience is telling us that this drive toward peer relations also has a basis in brain activity. So there's a group at Temple University led by Larry Steinberg, who's a developmental psychologist, and they have this nice paradigm. They call it the stoplight paradigm. It's a driving simulation task. And what they do is they bring teenagers as well as adults into a laboratory. They bring them in alone, and they bring them in with peers, with their best friends. And they have them do this driving simulation both alone and in the presence of peers. And one of the variables measured is the tendency to run yellow lights and to then engage in crashes potentially because of this risk-taking behavior. And I'll call your attention to the graph on the top of the page. The red bars illustrate the data for adolescents. The other bars are adults of various ages. But what you can see is that adolescents, when they're in the presence of peers, have more crashes in this paradigm, and it's due to risk-taking behavior. So they take more risks in the presence of peers. And that illustrates the point Ann was making before about how you can have a certain context that can be either beneficial or not beneficial, depending on the structure of the situation. And this is a great example. What also happens in the brain when adolescents are engaging in those risks is that the reward system is lighting up in a way that does not occur in adults when they have the same kind of activity. So this combination of risk-taking in the presence of peers is a particularly heightened thing for the adolescent, not only on behavioral levels, but on brain levels as well. So, to summarize that point, motivational systems then are in a state of overdrive in the adolescent period. This is something that supports many positive developments that really are neglected, I think, in much of our field. The promotion of agency, independence, peer relations, and the drive toward a successful adult independent life. Well, what happens in the context of trauma? That's what many of us are interested in today. We know that these processes are altered. The developmental timetable is altered at both behavioral and brain-based levels. So I'm just going to mention a couple of, just very briefly, findings by Douglas Bremner, who's done research in this area for a number of years. He has not focused primarily on children, but the principles from his work, I think, can be applied to people of many ages who experience trauma. So one finding, and this is not actually his own work, but he cites it, is a paradigm looking at stressed versus non-stressed animals. Of course, in animal studies, there are limits to how much trauma you can impose on an animal and still be within ethical bounds. But what they find is that when they stress animals to where they're experiencing chronic stress, synaptic structure changes. And this is an example of this in a brain region called the hippocampus, which is central to memory and kind of linking emotional and cognitive processes. And so under stress, you could almost think of it as an acceleration of a pruning process. The synaptic structure starts to prune back. And so in adulthood, this is a bad thing because at that point you need all the brain structure that you have. And as many of us are aging, we truly recognize that to be true. In childhood or adolescence, you don't want the pruning process to exceed what should be happening on the basis of normal development. And then as just another example of this same phenomenon, they also observe in people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, including people who have been victims of childhood abuse, reductions in the volume of the hippocampus. So as I said, tissue loss is one of the consequences of trauma, but is also part of a normative process. It's two different mechanisms, though. So this is more the toxic kind of process, like Ann referred to, whereas normal pruning in the adolescent period is a normal process that builds a better brain. So we don't want these things to go overboard. So in adolescence, we have the potential in the context of trauma for too much of an acceleration of tissue loss. And that can impact cognitive capacities. At the same time, because of how this toxic process unfolds, motivational systems might actually be in more of a sense of overdrive than they otherwise would be. And I didn't talk about the stress system, but that's another motivational system at play here. And then this sums up to difficulties with behavioral regulation. So balance is important. That's what we want to achieve. And in adolescence, the normal state of affairs is actually for the scales to be tipped a little bit more in the direction of motivation, a little bit less in the direction of high-level cognition. So how is it that some people are more resilient than others, that some have increasing cognitive capacities for reflection, that some are better at relationships, and some have this strong sense of agency? And by the way, it's not necessarily the idea that every person will have all of those things. Individuals will vary in their strengths. Well, we don't really understand completely, I have to tell you, how it is that these individual differences interact with brain development. But what we do know is that individuals come into this period with relative strengths or weaknesses in these areas. And then development sets the boundaries around which those strengths and weaknesses can operate. So the challenge, I think, in the field is to understand the definitions of those boundaries so that we can encourage strengths to their maximum and discourage weaknesses as well. And so I'll just close with the final take-home point, which I mentioned earlier, is that a developing brain, again, is a malleable and receptive brain. It's good that we have the opportunity to intervene at a time when there are these neural changes taking place. And in the context of those changes, we have the potential to make a difference in how the neural structure continues to change and then how behavior unfolds as a result. So I will stop there, and thank you for your attention. And now Ann is going to join me back up at the podium where we will welcome questions from the audience. I'd like to remind our participants in Greater Minnesota to send questions to cmh.umn.edu. Those of us here in person can either submit written questions to our volunteers, or there will be a microphone passed around if you'd like to ask us questions directly. Thank you.
I have to say, that was the best summary I've ever sat through. That was wonderful. I finally understand all those terms. Oh, and in 15 minutes. Anybody got questions? Yes. Okay. So we're going to wait, and we urge our Greater Minnesota members to get those questions in.
So the pruning that occurs during stress, do we have any evidence as to, is that like random pruning? Is it specific to essential
circuits. So
Yeah.
one thing maybe I should introduce as a clarification point is that people in the field of research, they don't actually like to call that aspect pruning because they want to distinguish it from the positive aspects of pruning. So they actually, to use a more loaded kind of phrasing, it's really cell death that's occurring. And the hippocampus has been targeted as an area of investigation because it does seem to be particularly vulnerable to these effects, and not really just in the context of traumatic stress, but also other kinds of insults that the brain might undergo as a consequence of other types of experiences or injuries. And it's not entirely clear why, as an area, it's vulnerable, but it's thought that it's because of the neurochemical constituents in that region of the brain where toxic processes have a greater impact there than other areas that might be better protected. And I didn't talk about the hippocampus too much functionally, but it's almost like an integration center in terms of the number of functions that it helps us with in terms of memory, emotional memory, placing experiences in context so that you can help to derive an appreciation on a brain level that, oh, in this context I should behave in this way, in a different context I should behave a different way. So it contributes to processes like that. It isn't the only area that's vulnerable, though. The stress system is also vulnerable. And that's located in the emotional centers of the brain as well. And then we're achieving a greater understanding of how the reward system also is potentially impacted by stressful experience, where the cellular structure actually changes and provokes that part of the brain to be more sensitized. And that might be one reason why people under a lot of stress are sometimes struggling with problems with things like substance abuse because the drives accelerate.
I think that what Monica's helping us see about the hippocampus and the other systems also lets us think about teenagers who have been traumatized, how much we struggle with that was then and this is now, or that was there and this is here. That isn't just a lapse of conscious memory, but really brain functioning.
That's an excellent point.
Somebody else said, please.
Hi, I thought it was a very good, both of them were very good presentations. I'm very interested in resilience because I'm an advocate for kids at risk for getting into the justice system. And one of the questions I have is, to what degree would a lot of these kids have learning and language processing disorders and depression and ADHD or whatever, that all inhibit all these factors that you talked about today and makes them, prime candidates for getting kicked out of school and suspended. And I'm always battling this with teachers and other people. How do we put this in a context that teachers can use to be to have a better interaction with kids?
I don't have kind of handy all the statistics about the overlap in those conditions that you mentioned with stress disorders, although I do know that depression rates are quite high. Learning disability, you know, what I would almost think is the case is that individuals who are experiencing stressful life circumstances have difficulty taking advantage of the learning that's provided. I would say that's distinct from a learning disability per se, because under better circumstances, I think they would be able to do better. Attention deficit disorder, tends to show up earlier in development. If it emerges later, again, we tend to think about it as a consequence of experience rather than a thing in its own right. But I think that the way that all of those conditions manifest themselves would be similar to the kinds of behavioral dysregulations that we might see in the context of trauma. So that for a teacher who hasn't had a full benefit of experience with an individual, they might be inclined to attach labels where the labels aren't, quite what we're after. However, I do think that interventions that help with all of those individual disorders might help with traumatic consequences in behavior that affect attention and learning and motivation and things like that. And I think we do have a lot of research to suggest that that's true, both in terms of behavioral interventions as well as pharmacology, although I know a lot of people don't like to go in that direction, at least at the start.
I'm just going to ask a question, if I can. So things like working memory, short-term memory, processing speed, how do those develop? Because I think one of the experiences that I'm having lately is having more neuropsychological testing and discovering how impaired many of these young teens are.
So how do they develop in terms of the timetable?
Yeah, and why are they so common among
Mm-hmm.
at-risk teens?
Well, I'll use working memory as an example. So working memory is your active memory, like all of you are using in the context of this presentation today, where you're trying to keep track of details and form your questions and sort of be active recipients, but also users of the information that we're providing to you. So working memory starts to emerge as a process late in the infancy period, and it gradually gets better and better and better into adulthood. And I think one piece of evidence we have in the adolescent period is that one of the things that's happening is that in a healthy person, you're able to juggle more and more pieces of information at the same time, which also is aided by processing speed and myelination in the brain. So you can literally mentally juggle a number of different things. Stress interferes, I'm just using the term stress instead of trauma, but I essentially mean the same thing, interferes with that process because it's an active kind of cognition. And so if there's something in the moment that is intruding on your thoughts, you can think of it internally as another source of information to be dealt with in the brain. So, and if, it could be things like you didn't get enough sleep last night even. You are worried about the argument you had with somebody a couple of hours ago. So it's all churning around in the brain in terms of management, and to be effective at cognition, you have to keep all those emotional things at bay, which uses resources. So you can think of the working memory system as a resource-using system where what it's trying to do is hone in on what's important in a given moment and suppress everything else. And if you have to put too much energy into the suppressing everything else, then those tasks that you have to do in the moment are done either less efficiently or not at all well. And I think that's why we often see that dynamic and that particular area of function being particularly salient as something that doesn't look like it's working as it should.
Over here and over here.
Does this work? Okay. Hi, I focus in teen out of school time. And so in thinking about the three factors of predicting resilience, like I'm hearing active engagement and relations, and then reflection and leadership and personal agency, how would you say that relates to like the 40 assets or YPQA, the youth program quality assessment, which a lot of programs are using? It just seems really interrelated of like the things that we focus on. And so would you say like these three maybe trump some, or are like the ones to really highlight in terms of limited focus and resources? And
Well, I think the problem with 40 assets is some of you are way younger than me, so maybe you can remember 40 assets. Right? But, as clinicians, one of the things that happens is the more we practice, the more complex we understand things and the more simple it needs to get. Simple is different than simplistic. That's really important. So when we talk about simple, we just mean in the face of a group of teenagers, how am I going to hold in my mind how I want to respond? And their stimulation is coming at me just as my stimulation is coming. So I don't think these trump any list, but I think if you go down your 40 assets, it would be interesting to see which assets fall into which category and how many of the assets integrate all three. So the idea of these is just to help us stay on our toes when a teen is coming at me and agitated. I want to think about how to respond in a way that I can use that agitation positively instead of negatively. So I may say something about, you're really telling me what's on your mind, and that's an important thing, instead of how dare you call me a blank, blank, blank. I want to have them in my mind. So I think that you'll find, and this is your challenge, look at your tools and think about how this fits. And let's get rid of the interventions that don't. Who else? Someone over here? You want to shout it out and okay.
If I could ask Monica if you wouldn't mind elaborating on the difficulties with behavioral regulation in terms of, is that because of the motivation towards the reward system? Is that the breakdown of the hippocampus? What is exactly causing that? And as a follow-up to either of you or both of you, how do we help increase behavioral regulation?
So I think it's really both. So the extent, in terms of, if we think just simplistically cognitive systems versus motivational systems, I think there are changes operating on both levels that are just tipping the scales away from the kind of balance we'd hope to achieve. My view on intervention is that adult intervention can help to provide some of that balance and reestablish regulation, but whereas ideally we'd like to have this be a more self-directed kind of process, sometimes you have to provide a little bit of either an emotional or a cognitive crutch. And I think that's the role that adults can play in this process, recognizing the ways in which the dynamic is potentially altered. Do you want to add to it?
One thing I'm going to ask you to do as we proceed, because I think these interventions are going to address this, think of regulation in a global way. Sometimes we talk about behavior regulation, which is intimately tied to affect regulation, which is terribly tied to cognitive regulation, which is really involved with relational regulation. So think about the whole package. And what you're hearing Monica say is that there's a great deal of integration that happens in development that will allow for behavior to be more purposeful, more intentional, and more useful, as opposed to destructive or scattered. So we want to think of the whole package.
Can I just, sure, please. Let me just add one thing. I think in some ways, too, there's not, in terms of which part of that equation contributes to any individual case, it's going to vary across people. And that'll be because of the strengths or weaknesses that people are starting with, so that in some cases, the dysregulation might be due more to what's happening emotionally, motivationally. In other cases, it might be more that cognition is not catching up. So in part, I think a big challenge here is to understand the individuals that you're dealing with, but in the context of understanding these broader kinds of changes that are most likely going on.
So ports of entry, I couldn't say the word, is a term that's used in some infant mental health programs. But you want to think of that, what Monica's saying is you want to go into where the person's strengths are and think about supplementing or scaffolding. I think we have time for one more question. Greater Minnesota, you're going to have to work harder because we got to, go ahead.
Says it's on. I'm thinking of a couple situations where there's traumatic brain injury that was involved with the trauma or abuse, or maybe not specifically with it, but that's a factor. And I'm wondering how that may affect some of the things we've been talking about.
Well, of course, it makes everything worse on the negative side if there's been that kind of insult to the brain on top of chronic stress. But, you know, we are just continually amazed at what the brain can do. And so it's easy, I think, to focus on the negatives in terms of what that kind of situation poses in terms of challenges. But again, you've got people in this malleable, plastic stage of development. So even in the context of injury, the brain's able to compensate in ways that you wouldn't necessarily predict. And again, there are no necessarily general rules that guide that, but working with individuals is likely to allow you to achieve some positive results. So maybe I could talk to you later too about the specifics of the kinds of things you're talking about, but just to say that yes, that's a double whammy, but it can still be overcome.
And this is a good topic or thought to leave. Monica said positive results. One of the things that I don't think we do enough of is help teens have a narrative, and a narrative that can be shared. So you have a traumatic brain injury, and you have to make a story about that can either have a positive kind of reorganizing meaning or a Monica said dead cells. Well, we kind of have the same dilemma. We unless we can help adolescents use us to have a long lens on life, they often implode. And so the narrative function of any, because we're interveners who tend to deal with meaning making more than specific, brain alterations. We want to help that meaning making part develop. So lots of this has a narrative to it. Things that happened to you when you were young made your brain not learn in the same way that other people do. And what can you do so that you feel more effective? All right, we want to keep that in mind. All right, so now we have a 15-minute break where you can talk to each other, think about questions for our next two speakers. We're going to move in a little more into intervention, but we'll come back to Monica's questions, and she's going to be here so we can keep building our knowledge. Thank you.
The next two presenters are Charlene Myklebust and Ed Frickson. And Char may be known to some of you. She certainly gets around a lot and speaks to a lot of people. She is the Executive Director of Mental Health and Partnerships in Intermediate District 287. So as part of her work, she supervises county contracts and area learning centers to ensure that students receive mental and chemical health services. Today, she's going to talk about the significance of integrating a lot of the factors that Monica and Ann talked about, the cognitive, affective, and behavioral skills into learning environments from preschool through high school. So here is Char.
Thank you. I'm here to talk a little bit about what's going on in the field of public education related to supporting resiliency in young people, in working with children who have been traumatized, and in generally developing some of the social and emotional capacity that we would like to see our young people have in order to lead successful lives in adulthood. So here today to talk about some of the recent tricks of the trade and some of the things that are going on out there, both nationally and at a local level. You may notice that I have this little device up here. This is called a Hoberman sphere. And the reason I have this is because it's such a handy tool for educators to have in the classroom. We've been talking a little bit about emotional regulation, about executive functioning, and about the ability to calm oneself down to reduce stress. And that's what this device can be used for. We can use it to help model the breathing pace that we would want to see in our students. Great way to start the day in a classroom, just to breathe in, and I'm going to ask you all to do this with me. Breathe in and breathe out. And in and out. In and out. And just doing a simple activity like that a few times a day with students is enough to help some of our students calm down and to relax and to refocus. And it also teaches young people to know that they do have some ability to regulate their feelings, their emotions, and in turn then to have some management over their behavior. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about social emotional learning. And when we look at this photo of our young people before they become teenagers, it helps to remind us that we had a lot of empathy for young people when they were younger. And when they get kind of large and loud, we often start blaming kids for their behavior. And so the kinds of things that we would have patience for young people when they're about this age group, when they get to be teenagers, we all of a sudden expect them to magically have learned this behavior that we want to see and magically learn the skills to manage their emotions. And it simply doesn't happen that way. We have to teach young people the skills that they need to have in life. And that is the whole field of social emotional learning. So what is social emotional learning? This resource, by the way, comes from CASEL, which is the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, CASEL, C-A-S-E-L. And if you Google casel.com, there's a wealth of resources available to talk about the whole field of social emotional learning and young people. And basically, what SEL is a set of skills that we need to teach young people that fall into these 5 domains. Self-management, so the ability for young people to recognize their emotions, to manage the intensity and duration of emotion, to name emotions, to be able to ask for emotional support is a very important SEL skill. Then self-awareness. You know, how aware am I of how I come across to other people, how I communicate with others, how I'm feeling, what I need at any particular time. Social awareness, having other-mindedness, being able to look at another person and know that that person is not thinking what I'm thinking or doesn't necessarily have the same feelings or priority that I have. And we see this in children with autism, of course, oftentimes, that there isn't that other-mindedness, and we have to teach children how to look at other people. And just because I'm fascinated with trains doesn't mean that every other child in my class is fascinated with trains. So teaching kids how to ask others about their interests. Then responsible decision-making. How do I make decisions that are healthy for me, that are healthy for those around me? And then finally, relationship skills. Being able to form friendships, keep friendships, be able to make good decisions about taking care of ourselves in a stressful situation with others. So those are the foundations of social emotional learning. Right now there is a Social Emotional Learning Act before Congress that's kind of stalled in committee at the moment, but if it does pass, it would really govern schools in terms of having some sort of expectation that there is an evidence-based social emotional learning approach in schools. And oftentimes, as educators, we tend to respond with not another thing. We can't handle another thing on our plates. And the exciting thing about social emotional learning is it isn't another thing. It's a way to do the thing that we're already doing. And so it's an approach. And actually, there's a lot of evidence, very interesting research about the impact of evidence-based social emotional learning programs. We know through the research, and this is based on a 2011 meta-analysis, a study of studies that was conducted by the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning. Hundreds of SEL programs were studied that had impact on thousands of students, and the documented significant outcomes of using evidence-based programs with young people were improvement in social emotional skills, so just generally better social emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman's mantra. Attitudes about self and others, so improved feelings of self-efficacy and improved goodwill and optimism about relationships with others. More positive attitudes towards school. Better social interactions with peers. This is a really important one because this is a big sell for educational administrators. Improved academic performance. And this was significant. Kids who had evidence-based social emotional learning instruction delivered with fidelity had an 11% improvement on their standardized high-stakes testing. Now, this is very significant. And there have been other social emotional programs that have even, in isolation, had higher achievement than that. And then also being a good team member, so learning how to work with others, which we know is going to be an essential skill in the 21st century workforce. It is right now. Intelligence is like a pea in an ocean if we don't have the context of social emotional resiliency and growth in young people. So we'll have a lot of bright people who really can't work well together, and that doesn't matter much then in terms of our productivity in the workplace. This study, by the way, was published in the February 2011 issue of Child Development, and the title of the article was Raising Healthy Children, if anybody's interested in following up on that. So we know that there are a lot of other programs that impact social emotional learning, but what we do know about effective SEL programming is that it includes instruction in and opportunities to practice an integrated set of cognitive, affective, and behavioral skills. It's characterized by learning environments that are trustful and respectful, and that means that in those learning environments, the adults get along as well as the students. The adults and the students get along, the students and students get along, but it's so important that adults working with each other in an educational setting behave in a respectful manner towards each other, demonstrate effective problem solving, demonstrate thinking about thinking, all the kinds of skills that we want to see in our young people. The neat thing about SEL programming also is that it's great for all kids. It's especially important to use with kids who've been traumatized, kids who have some post-traumatic stress kinds of struggles, attachment issues, but it's great for all kids. So it's great for the kids who are the movers and shakers at Edina High School, just as it is in some other populations of students. There are many other programs now in our public schools that support social emotional learning, and I just would like to reference a few of those. In the state of Minnesota now, it's required that teachers take a class in the early warning signs of children's mental health disorders. It's not much, but it's a start, just to have teachers have the framework of being aware of the impact of mental health disorders on youth. And I'm continually just blown away by some of the responses when teachers have taken the class and say things like, I finally understand this is something going on in their brains, and just really coming to that realization, and what a significant paradigm shift that is when an educator is working with a student who has problem behavior. Another very important and popular program in our public schools is Ross Green's collaborative problem-solving approach. And in that particular approach, we would address kids as having lagging skills rather than irritating behavior. And oftentimes in schools, we've talked about that kid's not disturbed, he's just disturbing, you know. And so the collaborative problem-solving approach really teaches us to go deeper, look beyond, look behind, and not just respond to behavior, but really to understand that most kids do about as well as they can. And when they are having behavior that is getting them in trouble, when they're being isolated from peers, when their teachers are not liking them, when they're having struggles in the community, they're still doing about as well as they can. And it's our responsibility to teach them the skills they need to be successful, just as we teach academic skills. And we can't expect to have a student learn to attend school because we suspend them for being truant. It's one of the most ridiculous interventions out there. And luckily, the Minnesota Department of Education now has a program where there are several districts participating in trying to reduce suspension rate. And I am really proud to say that in one of the settings that I supervise, the South Education Center, we have had the alternative program. We have had 0 suspensions this school year, 0. It's really exciting. And, you know, we've had some days when there's been a lot of stuff going on, and it's been kind of interesting, but we just are committed to not kicking the kids out of school, but rather teaching them the behavior that will enable them to stay in school. Another program that I'm very excited about is mindful education. And mindful education is teaching students to be in the here and now without judgment, to pay attention to what's going around them, to kind of still their minds. And it's there's a recent curriculum that was just published by Scholastic, and it was written by people from the Hahn Foundation. I happen to have had the privilege of being on the writing team for the program, and it's really about taking mindful opportunities while teaching academic subject matter, just to reflect about what were the characters thinking in that particular novel? You know, in Hunger Games, you know, what's going on emotionally with the characters? And let's talk about that. Let's do perspective taking. What do you think the perspective is of the group of people who are holding these Hunger Games? What's the perspective of the sister who volunteered to replace her younger sibling and participated in the game? So those are the kinds of mindful activities that we can just use to help kids remember material that we're trying to teach and to connect emotionally with it, because we know that we're more apt to remember something if we do have an emotional link to it. We do know that by engaging the amygdala in the brain, we haven't talked a lot about the amygdala, but it's a little almond-shaped structure that is in the feeling system or limbic system of the brain, and it's right next to the hippocampus, the memory area of the brain. So anytime we can get kids interested by having something novel, then the amygdala will pay attention to it, will be more apt to remember it. Unfortunately, the amygdala pays attention to danger as well. And so anytime we have a situation in school that's too stressful, too dangerous, then that's going to be very well remembered. It's why trauma is so well remembered. Then character education programs, and those are programs that help build the capacity to do things like engage in good citizenship activities, volunteer activities, and we know that when people do things for other people, it actually helps their state of mind more than the recipient of the activities. So when we are helping others, it's really good for our brains. We benefit more than the people we're volunteering on behalf of. And anti-bullying programs. What we know about anti-bullying programs is that it's very significant to intervene with the bystanders, and that's kind of the new focus of anti-bullying programs, that we used to just talk about looking at the perpetrator and then teaching the victim some ways to, either brush it off or walk away or advocate for oneself. But now we know that we have this mentality, and the nucleus accumbens, the reward system in the brain, is actually lighting up when we got all our peers around and we're watching some action going on. So what we want to do is capitalize on that by teaching the bystanders how to have a group mentality, that this is not okay, and that it's cool to stand up against bullying rather than participate by being a passive bystander. And then finally, positive behavior interventions and supports. And this is a big movement as well in education, in which rather than addressing behavior once it occurs, we want to prevent problem behavior, and we want to have positive interventions when it occurs. And that means making those teachable moments, intervening by teaching the skill we would like to see the students demonstrate, and then coming back at it and not losing our cool as adults, making sure that we know it's our job to do this. We're getting paid to do this. It's not the student's job to make us emotionally comfortable. We're in the wrong work if that's our goal. And sometimes with new teachers, it's just teaching them to don't just do something, stand there. Oftentimes we're so quick to intervene, and sometimes it's just noticing, being mindful ourselves, just noticing behavior. But we don't always have to intervene or do something or stop it. That's control. So with that said, that's pretty much the overview, the quick and dirty overview of SEL, but it's very exciting. Lots of schools are getting interested in implementing SEL programs. On this CASEL website, there are something like 90-some programs that are approved as evidence-based SEL programs that will make a difference in schools if they start using them. So anytime you have an opportunity to suggest that in a school setting, please do so, because it needs to happen. So thank you. And now I would like to introduce a new acquaintance of mine, Ed Frickson. Some of you may know him from his former work as an ACE project director for Ramsey County Human Services. And currently, he's the executive director of Mental Health Services for Family Innovations, Inc. He's also a trained trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapist. And it's this work that will frame his comments this morning.
Thank you, Shar. As I get started here this morning, I need to first, tip my hat to a friend and colleague of mine. Her name is Jennifer Wilgocki. She is a nationally certified trainer in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and she's a part of a nationwide consortium, the NCTSN, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Very good organization that brings all the research from around, especially the Western world, but around the world at whole, and brings it to practice. And one of Jennifer's mantras that I am stealing from her is that as trauma clinicians and folks in the field of practice with traumatized kids is to steal shamelessly and share relentlessly. So I am here today to share relentlessly some material I have stolen with Jennifer's consent that she provided to me as we're now implementing this in the company I'm with. This iceberg I have found, this simple but majestic, I think, picture of an iceberg is the best way I've found to really understand not only how a traumatized child experiences self, but how their family can get caught up in trauma that their child has been exposed to, and how clinicians and other care providers can as well. I'm going to come back to the iceberg and unpack that a little bit and dive under the surface later in the few minutes that I have with you today. But I found this to be incredibly valuable. A couple of things with the iceberg at the moment. Kids work really, really hard in 3 areas that are all part of the symptom clusters of PTSD. The one I'll talk about a little bit most today is avoidance. Kids work hard at avoiding dealing with what they were exposed to that was really traumatic. Ann Gearity has done a really good job, and I remember something she said as we were planning this conference. Trauma is like a blow to a kid's soul and heart. We have to remember that, and they want to avoid going there and dealing with it, okay? So kids are like the 90% of the iceberg under the surface of the water that we can't see, and they work hard at staying on the top of the surface, okay? And sometimes us as parents, as caregivers, as therapists, want to stay on the top of the iceberg too. So we'll come back to that. But, and many of you probably know this again, but the 3 primary symptom clusters for PTSD are re-experiencing trauma with intrusive thoughts, okay, or sensations and memories of what happened to them, whether it was a one-time acute episode of trauma, chronic or complex trauma. Avoidance, where there's emotional numbing, where they're shutting down, they're in some cases literally avoiding situations, or where they're aroused, where they're hyper aroused, and where they're looking really belligerent with a flash temper. Shar, I'm sure, has seen some of that on those interesting days she talked about in the school setting she's at as well, with kids who are coming with their back brain on high alert. Kids who are traumatized, not all of them, because some come with many more strengths than others, depending on what's going on in their context and their social and relational environment, get stuck in trauma, and their back brain is on high alert. And that's what leads to that hyperarousal and vigilance piece. As I'm going through this today, my role is as a clinician as well. I work a lot with traumatized kids on this particular model called TFCBT for school-age kids. So I'll be kind of weaving in a little bit about some stories of young people that I've worked with over the years, with some level of success and some others no success at all, based on where I was at in the time in my training and understanding. So I'll be talking about that as well today. A couple of takeaways that especially I want to focus on. Avoidance. It's so easy for kids to want to avoid dealing with this, and for professionals to collude in that avoidance, okay? And we're not honoring our kids and helping them through tapping into their level of resilience, wherever that is, in not colluding with that avoidance. That's all about staying above the waterline on the top of the iceberg. So a few principles here, some takeaways. It's the child's experience of the event, not the event itself, that is traumatizing. Very, very important here. And this is what sets a therapeutic healing process apart from a child protection investigation, a police officer who's sitting down with the kid, or in many cases, a clinician's understanding when a child comes to us in our office or in our home-based work that we're doing as well with traumatized kiddos and their families to understand their subjective reality. To unpack that a little bit, I saw a young man in my office about 1.5 years ago who came with a significant chronic history of being sexually assaulted. He estimated about 200 to 300 times, sometimes with a weapon used as a threat for him to comply. Very sweet-souled young man, and he started acting out in school by being a little more belligerent and a little more pushy with other kids in the lunch line. And the principal called Mom and said, "What's going on with your kid? I've never seen this before." Mom didn't know, okay? And it led to the point of where this young man then acted out on a younger family member. One time where the mom of his younger sibling walked in when this was happening and said something to him. And he took it as a threat of harm to himself, that blow to his psyche. Found out from that when then his mom asked, "Okay, what's going on?" It all came out about these hundreds of episodes that he had incurred on him that nobody had known about. Within there are lots of other things. He decided never to tell anybody based on a cognitive distortion. And what in the therapy process, it came out that I'm going to take this to protect other kids in my neighborhood. Okay? Another principle I don't have up here is that kids with trauma histories come up with absolutely brilliant and creative strategies to deal with the trauma that are horribly and personally costly. This is one decision this kid made that was really costly to him. It was a brilliant strategy, really caring strategy. His assumption was, but it was a distorted thought, that it would protect other kids. Okay? But what he identified through the process of a trauma-informed assessment that he and I went through was not the several hundred times he was assaulted. It was not that there was a weapon available for the perpetrator. It was that the one incident where his little sibling's mother came in and saw what happened and said what she said, that he feared for his life, even though he knew that this individual loved him, that he loved her. That was his trauma. Now, as a child protection worker, as a police officer conducting that forensic investigation, as a clinician, would we think that was his trauma that he identified? Probably not. What are we going to go for? These hundreds of episodes of sexual abuse. But we can't start there because that was not his subjective reality. It's the child's experience of the event that they identify as the most traumatic that becomes traumatizing for them. It's not our objective assessment of that. It's their subjective interpretation of what happened to them. Okay? So again, it's important to understand the difference between a forensic investigation, which is vitally important. We do have to understand what happened, how many times, things of that nature, so we can hold people accountable in the case of child sexual abuse. But we also have to understand clinically that the therapeutic healing process is very different. And it gets back to that child's experience, not our understanding of their experience. Trauma principle number 2. Trauma equals chaos. Again, back to Ann's, it's a blow to that child. Okay? Structure equals healing. Kids who are trauma exposed, especially those with chronic or complex trauma. Chronic trauma would be like the kiddo I just mentioned. Many, many episodes of a particular kind of trauma that they were exposed to over a course of time. Complex trauma is where typically it's going to be a parent or a loved one who is a part of and endorses or actively is involved in that trauma towards that child. And that takes longer to untie that and get into that. But trauma can lead a kid to feel chaotic internally and externally. Structure and safety can bring healing to these kids. We talked a lot about resilience today as well. Kids who have more resilience factors within them are going to be more successful. Some kids, and I remember one young man a long time ago now, before I understood anything about trauma-informed therapy, had a situation. He's living with his mom on the east side of St. Paul, and he heard the doorbell ring late one night. It turns out the resident on the upstairs apartment had been murdered. Her daughter came down the steps. He caught her as she was falling into the door with multiple stab wounds. Okay? This is the reality of the kids we see. I didn't have a clue, didn't have an understanding, because graduate school programs don't teach specific interventions about how to work with traumatized kids. So I had to go find it. I still remember this young man. Most of us who are clinicians probably have a few people that we'll carry with us. He's one, okay? And he was on high alert all the time. He was hypervigilant. His back brain was looking for danger all the time, because kids who are trauma exposed, their back brains go on high alert. That's where our alarm system sits, and it can get stuck, and his was stuck. And he was a dangerous kid. He's a big kid. He was involved in some gang-type activity, and when this happened, it just started to hardwire his brain. He never got to the place with me, unfortunately, where structure equaled healing, okay? One thing I always challenge people, no matter your role with kids and families, where you're thinking or aware that there's some sort of a trauma blow to a child, is to encourage them, if they're seeking behavioral health services, to ask some questions, okay? Can you explain why you're in therapy? Can you explain what's going to happen to you when you see your therapist? What are they going to help you with? And can you explain how long you're going to be in therapy? If the kid can't explain it, if the parent can't explain it, and most importantly, if the therapist can't explain it, we might want to go back and revisit that. Okay? Because unfortunately, but realistically, some kids are in therapy for years, and they don't know why they're going. They know they're acting out behaviorally. They may know that something had happened to them, but they can't articulate, here's what I'm working on with my therapist, here's a beginning, here's a middle, here's an end. Okay? For kids with trauma histories, there should be a clear beginning, a clear middle, and a clear end to therapy for them so they can go back to being a kid. That's what some models and evidence-supported, Shar talked about evidence-based work in the schools. TFCBT is an evidence-based therapy. And the interesting thing going on for those of us who are clinicians, the managed care organizations are now starting to ask the question, as they're sending members that they're paying for services, what are you doing? What are we paying you to do? And how can you show us what you're doing and how it's being effective? That's what evidence-based therapies do, and that's what TFCBT does, with clear baseline measures and tracking changes over time. Some clinicians get really kind of squirrely about that because we don't like to be asked, are you making a difference? But TFCBT, for many kids, not all, can do that. Okay? So, ask the questions, no matter what your role is with a young person. Okay? If you're going to therapy, what are they working on with you? What are you doing? And how do you know when you're done? Key question. If you don't ask, they're not going to tell you in most cases. Back to avoidance. And we want to avoid colluding with that avoidance. If we know a young person is in our office or in our daycare setting or on our caseload as a case manager or a child protection worker, we want to have what's called a trauma lens. We want to be putting on our glasses, thinking about trauma and understanding that. We want to think about the iceberg, which I need to come back to. Okay? If we don't ask, they're not likely to tell us because they work hard psychologically and emotionally to not go there, to not go beneath the level of the surface of that iceberg. Okay? The 90% of an iceberg that's under the surface is darker, it's more mysterious, and it feels dangerous. Kids have a hard time going there. Many times they're stuck in their back brain. Their back brain is in high alert looking for danger. Shar, with this, what is this called again, Shar?
Hoberman's sphere.
Hoberman's sphere. And she had us all do an actual skill. It's part of TFCBT. It's called relaxation breathing. Breathe in, breathe out. Before we can actually go through a process of cognitive-based therapy with the child, we don't start up here in their prefrontal cortex. We start back here. We have to calm down their radar system. When we do relaxation breathing or progressive muscle relaxation, it causes our body to physiologically relax. And for kids who are on high alert, they have a hard time doing that. So we teach them the skill. Okay? You can't be both anxious and high alert and calm at the same time. So we teach them some skills to quiet this down, to start to shift from their back brain to their front brain through this process so that we can address and lead them through an exposure-based therapy. With the iceberg, it feels safer for lots of folks, including the kid, to stay up on top and to not go down into those darker pieces of their lives. But clinicians and caregivers need to be a part of a system to help them go there in a way that they can feel safe going through that process and come out the other side. Last slide here that I'll talk about briefly, and this is again a young lady I worked with who came with one of the worst histories of acute, chronic, and complex traumas I've seen. I won't get into the details. She had seen multiple psychiatrists, multiple therapists, and came to my office with all but one of these diagnoses. And some others that psychiatrists had posited. She was on, I believe, 4 different psychotropic medications. Only one of those clinicians had ever asked her about trauma. If we don't ask, they won't tell. Okay? She didn't like me because I asked. And we went through the process of teaching some skills and took her through TFCBT. Took her 24 sessions. okay? She was 16 when I met her. Her trauma had happened from age 0 to age 8. You name it, it happened just about. Went into foster care and then was adopted. And was going through all sorts of attachment issues with mom and dad and younger sibling, and was depressed when she came to me, among other things, okay? 24 sessions from start to finish, measuring clinical change over time. She still met criteria for ADHD at the end. She was not a developing borderline and didn't have a personality disorder. Came with depression. We cleaned that up through a process of exposure-based therapy by addressing that 90% of the iceberg. A couple of things in closing, a couple of resources for you, some more takeaways. The NCTSN, wonderful website. Lots and lots of research and practice modalities to work with kids. nctsn.org, I believe. Right here at the U of M, AMBIT Center, AMBIT, is the technical training center for the state of Minnesota, who are training therapists across the state in multiple modalities based on trauma-informed care for kids. TFCBT is a core that they've really helped contribute to the better care and well-being of kids in our community. I think my time is up. Thank you. So I'd ask again that as Shar joins Ann and myself at the front for the second Q&A, remember, for those of you in outstate Minnesota, to send an email in with your questions to cmh.umn.edu, cmh@umn.edu, or to use the microphone or to hand in a written question here on site.
Can we just stay here? Okay, so we have some questions from last time. We'll have some questions from this time. But before we do this, you have a choice. You can either write a question, or you can by yourself or with a colleague just take about 2 minutes and write something that you've heard that would shift your intervention. All right? So you have a choice. You can write it alone, you can talk to a colleague, or you can write us a question. All right, so 2 minutes. Just to make sure we all stay active. I think we will. Yeah. Can we do that? It just feels so. Yeah. Then we'll use that for the last one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you read this? What is the purpose of pruning in late adolescence in prefrontal cortex? She can see what this says. Yeah. Okay, so we'll ask that. Yeah, we'll ask that. Okay.
Yeah.
That was lovely. So it just follows. I mean,
it does. It really is a nice building block.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
Workshop.
two that I gave you that were left over were from.
Okay, so now how do I get the box?
It won't start until this is what they're seeing right now. And so then when Nimi comes up, she'll.
Okay, so will Carrie tell me when to do that?
I'll start timing. Yeah.
Okay.
When the Q&A is over, and then you introduce Nimi when you're finished.
All right. So let's reconvene. All right. Thank you, Shar, and thank you, Ed, for moving us into the practice domain. We're going to do questions and answer questions with Shar and Ed. We have a couple from Greater Minnesota that we're going to get to that will pull Monica back up here, and we'll see where we go. Let me take the prerogative of having the microphone. I think there's two things that I heard that seemed critically important. The first was Shar's use of learning. And if we think of mental health is really the capacity to keep adapting and learning. And mental illness becomes the increasingly difficult capacity to keep adapting and learning. So the idea of learning is so important, and we're so grateful to Shar for reminding us that social emotional learning takes the same kind of perseverance and intervention that any other kind of learning does. Teachers are very good at understanding remediation in reading and writing, but not in social emotional learning. The second is Ed brings up, and there's a question here that I'll pose to Ed about this idea of trauma is in the eye and body of the beholder. So we want to think of trauma residue. I think we've all gotten very interested in trauma, but a lot of people are telling children about their trauma rather than experiencing with the child what the trauma means to the child. So Ed's example is a beautiful one where the young man who had been perpetrated on felt most traumatized when he was revealed as a perpetrator. You know, now we know children take in the whole experience, so in his mastery to try and figure it out, he got turned on, and that became, but that was his meaning. So that was so important. So Ed, one of the questions that we have is how do you identify the child's experience in trauma, and what do you ask?
That's a great question, and I was just telling Shar that when I've had an opportunity to talk in settings like this, I always get that question. How do you ask the question of a child who's avoiding or doesn't want to talk about it or has it buried so deeply there at the very bottom of that iceberg? Another concept first, as, again, a protection worker, case manager, parent, daycare provider, teacher, social worker, psychologist, is having a trauma lens, okay? So that as you're interacting with that child in that therapeutic relationship or whatever that relationship is, having a lens just thinking about trauma. So that when a kiddo is acting out, well, is that oppositional defiance? Or is there something else going on? So just having a lens thinking about trauma. Because we don't always know who's, as a clinician, what's coming into our office or what's going on in a home-based therapy appointment or what's going on in an EBD classroom. So has been my best way to answer the question without giving specifics. Here's what you do. There are some good trauma assessment instruments out there. There are some trauma screeners out there as well. I don't have those available, but either through the U today or you know, you can find me, talk to me afterwards today too, and I'll get you my contact information. I can give you some more information about just how to start to elicit some information from kids. But primarily it's about having a trauma lens. So when a kid comes in, we're starting to think not about what diagnosis they have, but what's going on for them. Are we looking at an iceberg kid and an iceberg family or not?
So, Ed, can I just add a 2 cents? You also need to have a developmental lens, right? Yes. So an 8-year-old is going to organize a trauma very differently than a 15-year-old. So your young man, you know, he tries to be active in adolescent function, and it reorganizes his sense of self in a way. But so the developmental lens with the trauma lens will serve you very well. Other questions? Yes.
Sorry.
Do we have? Oh, good. Go ahead,
Sorry.
Lily. No, go ahead, Lily. Go ahead.
Hi, I just have a question. I was really fascinated by some of the issues that you raised, and I see a lot of kids who have experienced trauma as an advocate, but I'm concerned about the number of kids who are then made to be registered as sex offenders. And it's a real problem, and I don't know to what degree, you know, which of those kids should be and which shouldn't, and I just needed some guidance on how to talk to somebody about that.
Oh. It's hugely problematic, and it's where, you know, I'm going to say at the end, but I'll say it here. I think we are the believers in the room, and how do we help the non-believers? I mean, how do we help people understand that adolescence is a developmental process, and that adolescents are still capable of learning and growing? And what are the decisions that preclude that learning and growing? Hugely problematic. I think the juvenile justice population, I think the latest figures I saw was 70% have mental illnesses and 82% have been traumatized. So this phenomena of, you know, being the victim and trying to then master victimization by trying to make sense of things is something that we really have to struggle with in the community, at the same time that we have to teach adolescents about norms and expectations so they stay part of the club. So I'm going to go back to Shara's comment about suspensions. You know, I mean, it makes us all crazy with adolescents when they're kicked out of the club and there's no remediation to help them be in the club. And by club, I'm using that very global social contract idea that I won't hurt you if you don't hurt me. And when I hurt them by kicking them out and I have no way of helping them by coming back in, we really break that social contract that adolescents need to tolerate our disapproval when they violate a norm, but tolerate it in a way that they can keep learning. Very hard. We only have 5 more minutes, so yes?
Oh, hi. I almost feel like I don't need this. I've had a lot of coffee. We have so much to say. I came with a couple colleagues, so I'm going to try to be brief.
Okay.
But we come from a nonprofit, and we're directors and supervisors in the youth program, and we are all about trying to sort of shift the paradigm at our agency in a trauma-informed way and not ask what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, which is sort of that shift in thinking. But what we come up against is that we have youth workers who are doing the direct service with youth who may not be educated in this, and we're trying to train them. And so our question is really, and also just in our agency, if we want to try to, if we're at a multi-service agency and we've got all of these people coming in, low income, looking for jobs, we have family violence program, all of this stuff. How do we train even, and how do we inform the receptionist at the front desk in a trauma-informed way? And what kind of tools do we, just simple tools, for instance, you know, the breathing or the tools that we want to teach everyone in our agency so that we're all on board in this sort of paradigm shift, rather than it just being a therapist in the room with a child, because obviously that's not the only person that comes in contact with all, you know, our participants and our clients.
Well, you're really talking about systems change and creating a culture that responds to adolescents, challenged adolescents. So let's ask Shar, who has transformed a culture.
Or at least tried to do so. Well, one of the things in our district that we did was bring a sort of a disparate group of people together, some of whom were believers in our being able to shift our thinking about kids, and some of whom weren't. And we had a focused task force planning session where we all came to consensus that we need to provide social emotional support for our students. And in doing so, we introduced people to all of the evidence-based opportunities out there for shifting the culture. And many of our programs are using very different programs and very different curricula, but the fact that they're using something is what seems to have made the difference. And so just having some sort of systematic way to have a toolbox of interventions and ways at viewing behavior. And it's really made a significant difference, and we've seen the culture gradually transform. We still have a ways to go, but definitely if you get my email address, I'd be happy to send you some resources because I'd love to share. I also did want to make a comment, too, about the whole sex offender registration issue, because in my checkered work life, I used to work as a therapist in a juvenile sex offender program. And what I will say is that in a really good program, well over half of the kids go on to never recidivate. So over half of our juvenile sex offenders can be rehabilitated. And it's a different percentage when we look at adult offenders when there hasn't been an early intervention. But it's scary when we think about the stigma for life when kids can definitely be rehabbed.
In October, if any of you were here, Lessons from the Field did a workshop on the crisis nursery, and that would be the other resource to check with. They decided to make a paradigm shift, and they called it the nursery way, and I was part of that. And what they did was they started training, and they trained everyone. There was a basic seminar training that talked about trauma, that talked about development. They had the executive director, they had human resources, they had the secretary at the front desk. They had everyone be part of it. And what it allowed was a common language that they were all starting to use, and that nursery way has continued. So I think that your question is an excellent one. How do you change the culture? Let me offer another question. And although it is the child's individual experience of the traumatizing event that's important, is there any relevance in addressing issues characterized by events as opposed to their child's individual experience? So I think what I'll say to we want to pay attention to the individual experience. What about the police report or the objective data? What do we do with that?
What I've done with that, I'll give one specific example and then talk about the therapeutic process of developing a trauma narrative with a child. I've gotten calls 3 times from attorneys or judges' clerks asking me to come and testify in cases because they want to know the facts. So in each of those cases, I've called them back and said, I'd be happy to come and testify. However, you need to understand that what I say may not align at all with your child protection worker's forensic evaluation, because this kid isn't saying that, because that's not his or her experience. So that's one piece. The therapeutic process, and TFCBT is an exposure-based therapy, helping the kid dive under the surface to play around in that 90% of the iceberg. And that process helps them through identifying emotions, through identifying both distorted and clear thinking processes, and linking those two behaviors, start to make sense of their experience. This is a part of their story. And then an important part of that is having a witness to their narrative, inviting somebody else into that process, typically a parent or a grandparent. I've had a school social worker on one occasion due to a unique circumstance. But to help them, where through the process of developing that narrative, it takes time, they can start to incorporate in some of those more objective pieces and to help make sense of the police investigation, which can be a type of trauma for that child too, because they're going back and revisiting that. So that would be one way to think about that.
So Ed, there's always a shared narrative, and part of what we do is help the child exposure therapy tolerate the story And that's lovely. Let me just say one last question. I'm going to ask it as a question, but we're not going to try and answer it. So you can think about it. Do any of the presenters know about or have experience with collaborations with places of worship or faith-based organizations? And I think we're going to come to that quite naturally in our next two presenters. There are two more questions for Monica. What is the purpose of pruning in late adolescence in the prefrontal cortex? And can you give examples? And what, if any, activities or disciplines can help slow the destruction of or rebuild cells in the hippocampus? So let's hold on to those two, and we'll address that in our last Q&A when we try to pull it together. All right? Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to part 3. Isn't this fun? I think the other culture thing is Judy should, package this and have a road show. This has been so interesting. So now I'm going to introduce Dr. Nimi Singh. Dr. Singh is a pediatrician and holds a graduate degree in public health. She serves as Division Head of Adolescent Health and Medicine in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Minnesota. And this morning she's going to share insights from her research and clinical work and describe how this integrates with Dr. House's work. So I'm really pleased to have Dr. Singh.
What I'd like to do is shift the conversation back to the individual. As you all heard, part of my role professionally is I'm a clinician. And, one of the pieces that we really forget to focus on enough, I think, particularly in medical practice, is the extraordinary capacity of the body and the mind to self-right. This is something built in that most of us take for granted. And the majority of us experience a variety of stressors in our lives that don't stop us in our tracks. Maybe we hit a little bump in the road and then we're back onto living our daily lives. And that's extraordinary that we can do that time and time again with physical stress, with psychological stress, but sometimes we get stuck. And what I really want to share with you in my section is to bring you back to an understanding of what it takes to support that capacity to self-right and how important those critical basic functions are in supporting that process. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use language that I use with patients and families. I work mostly with adolescents coming for anxiety and depression, emotional and behavioral issues, chronic health conditions. And I use this as the foundation, and I do talk about stress. So some of the language I'll use for many of you will be redundant, and please forgive me, but it helps to pull the whole story together. So, as all of us are aware, stress is not a bad thing, and it's evolutionarily advantageous in that it allows us to perceive a potential threat to our survival, typically in the environment, and then very quickly the human body will shift its chemistry such that you suddenly have this burst of energy available to you to get you immediately to safety. And so one way of thinking about, what happens in the body when that occurs. What happens is blood gets shunted to those organs that are critical for survival. So basically, you literally have blood flow carrying oxygen and nutrients to your heart, lungs, and muscles, because that's what you need, of course, to fight off a predator or run away or freeze and blend into the environment and hope that predator just takes you, misinterprets you as being sort of background material. Now, the same shift in blood flow occurs in your brain. So what happens there? Basically, what the blood flow shunts to, again, that component of your brain that is critical for keeping heart, lungs, and muscles going. So that's your brainstem. That's controlling heart rate, respirations, temperature. If the blood flow is shunted away from certain areas, shunted to certain areas, it means it's being shunted away from everywhere else. So who gets dinged? What functions, what areas get dinged? in the body, from the neck down, your gastrointestinal tract, your digestive capacity, your immune system. That's why when we're stressed and chronically stressed, those systems go awry. Now, what happens in the brain, of course, is the blood flow gets shunted away from, we've all heard earlier this morning how important the frontal cortex is and the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive functioning, the ability to creatively problem solve, to restore a bigger perspective, that gets impaired. And so what happens is our perceptions around us get distorted. And we start interpreting information in our environment in a distorted manner that then can lead to further difficulties. So the good news is, with that stress response getting triggered, most of the time it shuts off when we're in balance. But we sometimes get stuck in stress mode when we're out of balance. And we'll talk about what it is that creates that lack of balance. But before we do that, I want to focus on a way of more deeply understanding what actually happens to our thinking when we're in stress mode. So initially we have increased arousal, alertness, and vigilance. And what we are designed to do is deliberately overinterpret every stimulus in our environment as if it's a potential threat. So that's why that adolescent who's stressed and comes home from school and is worried about that history test that's 2 days from now, and oh my gosh, I really should have started studying this weekend, but then I got caught up with my friends, and now I have to do all this studying, I have to do all this reading tonight, and how am I going to get all of this done? And that young person walks into the kitchen, runs into their dad. Dad looks up and says, "How was your day, dear?" And that kid just bites his poor dad's head off. Why does that happen? Why do we do that when we're stressed? It's because that stress physiology is actually making the individual overinterpret every social interaction, every stimulus as being more caustic, more threatening than it really is. Now, the good news, again, is that young person probably goes off, gets to their room, realizes, wow, I just yelled at dad, calms down, comes down and apologizes, and maybe the parent in his or her wisdom will say, well, I saw that you were stressed, it's okay. That's fine when we have relationships with people who know us and can forgive us. But what happens when that happens in a setting where that's that person's first impression of us, or we don't get to go back and explain? Then it can create greater difficulties socially, emotionally, certainly in school, the child who's acting out, the teacher who is trying to manage 30 kids like that, makes it really challenging. So again, what happens is in that moment of stress physiology, the mind goes blank, and thinking is reflexive, not reflective. So chronic repetitive negative thoughts become anxiety disorders. What happens is if you generate a negative thought and then that triggers a stress response, you're more likely to generate more negative thinking. And if there are worries about the future, we call it an anxiety disorder. If it's anger, sadness, regret, shame, guilt about the past, we call it depression. PTSD, we've already heard the definition, but it's again playing negative thoughts in our heads that are not present moment thinking, that are creating more stress and trapping us in that cycle of distorted thinking. So then it makes sense why drug and alcohol use and even cutting behavior is a reprieve. It's a temporary ability to pop out of that storm of negative thought back into present moment, which in contrast feels like a relief. So there are many self-reflection skills that are taught that are very effective. Self-regulation therapies like progressive muscle relaxation, deep breathing, mental imagery, mindfulness therapies that drop us out of our story into the present moment, which again can shut off your stress physiology because you're not playing that negative story anymore. And the blood flow goes back up and you think clearly again. And cognitive therapies that basically teach you to recognize your own distorted negative thinking. But even learning those can be impaired if you don't go back to the critical first steps, which is the extent to which sleep deprivation prevents this ability, suboptimal nutrition, lack of physical activity, and recreational activities. And I really would like to go through the science of that with you, because it sounds like, oh, that's grandmother wisdom, or we all know that, that's an aside. We need to be putting our focus front and center on these basic needs and really maximizing them if we expect the children we work with, children and adolescents, to really recover who have gotten stuck. So sleep. 2003 National Survey of Children's Health demonstrated that approximately 15 million children and adolescents have inadequate sleep. And these, we know, inadequate sleep is in and of itself a risk factor for anxiety and depression. Anxiety and depression, of course, themselves also lead to poor sleep quality and quantity, and then it can become a vicious cycle. Optimal hours of regenerative sleep. This is the time is between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. And think about how many teens you work with or that you know who are missing some of that time. What happens during this period? Your stress hormones, your cortisol, should drop to minimal levels, and then growth hormone and all the other hormones that are responsible for growth, healing, and repair turn on. And if one is up, the other one's down. So if you're still up and about and stimulated and engaged in activities, your cortisol's up. You don't have that time to do the growth and healing and repair. And these are the critical hours. So think of your kids who are struggling with anxiety, depression, chronic illness, who are missing these hours. They're missing out on valuable repair time. What interferes? School schedules, intellectually stimulating activities, particularly if they're within a couple of hours before bedtime. So TV, internet, and reading. I mean, if they're reading a math book, fine. But if they're reading Hunger Games, they're going to stay up till 2 until they finish that book. So you really have to be judicious about, what reading is okay reading before bedtime. Caffeine-containing foods and beverages. We really don't monitor and talk enough about the extent to which caffeine makes it into the diet. When I was growing up, you didn't get to try coffee till you were 18. I mean, somehow, like my parents knew, no, you don't get to have that. And we don't regulate it that way anymore. It really can interfere with adequate sleep. What helps? Limiting daytime naps, exercising during the day. Boy, exercise. If we could put the physiologic effects of exercise in a pill, we would solve 70% of chronic illness in this country. And that'll be the next slide. Sleep environment is really critical. Quiet, dark, no distractions. How many of our kids have TVs and computers in their bedrooms? Not a great idea. Sleep routines are really critical. Really trying to limit eating and digestion at least 2 hours before going to sleep. Think about that highly scheduled young person who gets home at 9:30 and is having dinner. And then they're going to be up till 12:30 or 1 doing their homework. And we expect that person to get over her anxiety with a pill? Not going to happen. Really, really hard. Got to go back to the basics. Nutrition. So our brain only weighs 3% of our total body weight, and it consumes 20% of our calories. We really need to optimize our nutrition in order to help that healing component. We minimize breakfast. We let kids run out the door without having breakfast, but breakfast really sets the tone for the day. There are studies, really good studies, looking at cognition and functioning, intellectual achievement in school-age kids who eat breakfast versus not, eat a nutritious breakfast versus not. And there were real scientific findings there. We need protein plus complex carbohydrate and omega-3 fatty acids or fish oil for optimal brain functioning. We maintain focus better, improve schoolwork, it improves attitude. Skipping meals can lead to low blood sugar and then the spiking of insulin later on. That then results in very low blood sugar and that drowsiness that, quite frankly, many of us experience in the afternoons. If we're not eating at the right times or we're not leaning towards more whole foods, we tend to have that crash that happens in the afternoon. It happens with kids as well. So think about those kids who are struggling with mental health issues who experience that. That's usually when they're going to decompensate in the classroom. What's the story about whole foods versus processed foods? Whole foods have the vitamins and minerals, the micronutrients you need to be able to extract energy from food. If the diet is predominantly processed foods, those micronutrients are leached out and the body is not able to use the calories that it's taking in to optimize production of energy. I'm going to torture you guys for a second and go back to high school biology. You may remember something called cell respiration, the way the cell takes oxygen and combines it with one molecule of sugar or glucose, and there are two pathways that it can go down in the powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria. It can go down the optimal path where if you have all the vitamins and minerals and nutrients from whole foods, that one glucose molecule produces 36 molecules of energy, or ATP. If your diet is lacking in those vitamins and minerals, and we are in general a micronutrient deficient nation, if you don't have those micronutrients in sufficient quantities in the cell, that same glucose molecule produces 2 molecules of ATP, 36 versus 2. And many of our patients, our clients are basically functioning on 2 molecules of energy per molecule of glucose instead of 36. What does it take to get to 36? Dark leafy greens, colorful fruits and vegetables. It is no more complicated than that. And we just dismiss this deeply understood nutrition science as if, well, that's sort of irrelevant, and it's critical. Other brain nutrients that are important are, we know, fish oil. There are lots of psychiatric studies now, particularly in the British Medical Journal, that demonstrate that adding omega-3 fatty acids or fish oil, even to the psychotropic, the drug regimen of people with schizophrenia, improves their drug response, improves their functioning. We're seeing that adding fish oil to the regimen, the dietary regimen of kids with anxiety and depression, reduces inflammation, improves brain functioning. Vitamin D deficiency, huge issue. So I always screen for patients for vitamin D, and if it's low, that needs to be supplemented. That too reduces inflammation, improves brain functioning. And water. We don't drink enough water. So physical activity. Over 18,000 studies have been done to show the effects of exercise on mental health. The best exercise, the one that the young person is willing to do, that they enjoy, and they maintain over time. That's the right answer. Not what we think, what they're willing to do, what they're interested in. Ideally, 3 to 5 times a week. And honestly, you don't get a whole lot more benefit beyond 30 minutes. But even if a child did 10 to 15 minutes on a regular basis, 3 to 5 times a week, that could be tremendous in reducing stress physiology and improve brain functioning. And for those of us who are over 30, one of the most protective lifestyle changes against Alzheimer's is 30 minutes of exercise daily. Hugely powerfully protective. Mechanism of action, all these things, increasing blood flow, reducing inflammation, it alters your brain chemistry, improves sleep. And there are actually good scientific studies that show that aerobic activity, strength training, and yoga improve mental health. Last slide. We also forget the importance. Believe it or not, as a clinician, I almost use this as part of my therapeutic plan. I really want to plug young people back into reconnecting with activities that they maybe used to do when they weren't struggling with their anxiety or their depression. Something that when they did that, they were in the present moment and they just felt relaxed. They weren't worried about anything. They weren't comparing themselves to other people or judging themselves. So hobbies are critical. Now, you can't assign a hobby, but you can certainly get into the history and find out, what did you used to like to do? You know, when was the last time you did that? Would you be willing to pick that up again and see how that goes? Quiet, unstructured time. Our whole culture has forgotten the critical importance of quiet, structured time. A friend of mine the other day had a conversation with me about, the Sabbath, and what was the Sabbath about, or or observance on Friday or Saturday. It's about giving human beings the time to shut off, drop down into that reflective state, and reconnect and rebalance with their health and well-being. And then the last thing I'll mention is the really interesting areas of research that are emerging that are showing the power of nature in improving mental health and creative play. And these are 2 authors that many of you may be very familiar with. Their books are well worth reading. Again, reminding us that we have to go back to what I like to call grandmother wisdom. eat your fruits and vegetables, move your body, get enough sleep, and do something fun. Thanks. And now I'd like to introduce Antony Stately. Dr. Antony Stately is our final presenter this morning. He has spoken nationally and locally about historical trauma and its impact on health, and has worked with Karina Walters. Many of you will remember her presentation at Lessons from the Field a number of years ago. Presently, Antony is the Director of Mental Health, Chemical Health, and Employee Assistance at the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community. Please join me in welcoming Antony.
Good morning. It's still morning, right? Yeah. Okay. Just making sure. Wow. So I made a really critical error when I decided to go last because there's this thing called contrast effects, right? So it's either a really good thing to go in the middle or it be first, but never last because it's really hard to sort of kind of follow a show like that. So anyway, I want to really give some really quick thank yous to Judy and to the university for inviting me to be a part of this program. It's a real honor to be part of this panel of speakers and presenters. Such amazing work that everybody's doing, and I really, really appreciate that, the opportunity to be involved in this. So my talk really is going to focus specifically around the work that I've been doing in tribal communities. And where I work right now, we're actually in the process of transforming our clinic into a trauma-informed clinic, where we are actually prioritizing a number of interventions that are specifically trauma-informed models. TFCBT, which actually all of my clinicians, including myself, have been trained in at the Indian Country Child Trauma Center, where Dr. D. Bigfoot did a cultural enhancement and adapted or enhanced the model using traditional Native American ways of thinking about healing and practice to enhance that model and use it with Native American children. We're also implementing somatic experiencing, which integrates biology-based trauma response based on Peter Levine's work. Great book that you can read that will help you, and it's a really simple read. And if you want to create a trauma-informed clinic, you can actually get that book for every single one of your staff members because it's so incredibly easy to read. Called Waking the Tiger, helps you to understand really from a developmental perspective and a biological perspective and a psychological perspective what trauma looks like and what our response looks like to that. And then we're also doing some stuff around integrating an approach called In Touch Again therapy, which actually takes an integrative attachment-based or heals attachment problems in children and families by using sensory modalities. So we take children, parents, grandparents, and actually we're in our clinic we're actually taking an intergenerational approach in some of that work because we know that the problems in families and with children and adolescents isn't just that they're traumatized, it's that their parents are traumatized, their grandparents are traumatized, and they come from traumatized histories, right? So we're going to actually tackle the problem by doing intergenerational stuff. So I'll just talk really quickly about what does historical trauma look like in tribal communities. This is a model that is actually adapted from a colleague of mine that I went to grad school with, Dr. Carrie Johnson. She has a lot more stuff on it, and I just, for the purposes of most of my presentations, I just kind of take the simple stuff and distill it into this slide. So basically, how many of you have ever heard of the term historical trauma? Oh, wow, great. Highly educated group. So that helps me, actually, tremendously. So the thing that I like to say about historical trauma, and I'm going to talk specifically about tribal communities, but what really helps me to help people understand the notion of historical trauma is that it's actually a phenomenon that that lots of communities, indigenous communities, or people all over the world have sort of kind of struggled with. It's not something that specifically is only owned by tribal people or indigenous people of Native North America. You know, it gets articulated all over the world. But what it looks like for a really simple model is basically we had all these historical traumatic events that happened to us as tribal people, and then the responses of those things that we're left with are things like some of the things we've been talking about, the trauma response: anger, depression, internalized shame, internalized cultural shame, post-traumatic stress-like disorder symptoms. And one of the reasons one of the things I like to say about specifically for our community or for our Native people is that one of the results of colonization and one of the impacts of the events that happened in our specific history was that our traditional ways of healing were actually outlawed very early on in the colonization process. So the medicine that we would have used to heal from some of these traumatic events were things that we were not able to sort of engage in, right? We weren't able to engage in our ceremonies and some of our traditional healing practices. So we had no tools, really effective tools as Native people, to deal with those problems that arose as a result of a traumatic exposure. And the bigger issue for historical trauma in tribal communities is that it wasn't a one-time assault, right? It's usually like, something that happened in tribal communities over many, many generations. So a way of thinking about that is, of course, we adapted. One of the ways we coped was we developed maladaptive coping mechanisms. A real prevalent problem in tribal communities is the issues around substance abuse. It's probably one of the biggest issues in tribal communities in terms of a mental health or a behavioral health problem, still to this day. The result of that is erosions in tribal and family systems that, the fabric of our communities that really started to erode. That, of course, led to more violence and more stress. And these are phenomena that sort of impact individuals, families, and communities in this very cyclical process across generations. And that's what those arrows are intended to signify. What's going on? Okay. One of the things I really wanted to sort of kind of encourage us to think about is we've been talking a lot this morning about brain development and social and emotional learning and all these other things, and we've been really kind of focusing our conversation on individual level, sort of how trauma impacts people individually, and I really want us to think about the broader context of history and the broader context of our communities and our social environments, right? That there's this really very fine, unique interplay that happens between the individual and those contexts that helps them to understand and place traumatic experiences into systems of meaning that help them to either respond with resilience or to go the other way. Some of the things we've been talking about this morning. In my work with tribal communities, one of the things, picking up on the thread that Ed mentioned about the way that children and adolescents, and quite frankly adults do this as well, so it's not just something that adolescents are challenged by. In the face of traumatic experiences, it's a real common sort of reaction for us to want to avoid kind of going and exploring that dark part of the iceberg, right? But one of the things that I typically do with tribal communities when I either do trainings or I talk with people who work with tribal people is to engage in like some of the stuff that Nimi was talking about, which is grandmother wisdom. Pull on those things that are already endemic within the tribal history or the tribal community or the family, those stories that of resilience that help them to understand that, one, we've survived, you've survived, and we've survived as a people, and we've survived as a family, and that's tremendous. There's tremendous value and strength right there in that. And then remind them that there are things that we learn from looking at the natural world and our relationship to the natural world that can help us in confronting and facing adversity, including traumatic experiences. So how many of you have ever been out on the open plains or the open prairies and kind of experienced one of these horrific storms that sort of kind of just comes up out of nowhere? Anybody? Yeah. So what do you do when that happens? Find cover? Yeah. Find shelter, right? Okay. Well, it's kind of a little bit of a trick question. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a story that an elder tells. An elder told me, and I share this story a lot, and I'm sharing it with you as well. So over many centuries, millions of buffalo once roamed the Great Plains, right? And so they also, of course, experienced these big, huge storms that happen on the plains. As was common then and is still common today, there are these tumultuous thunderstorms, and the thunderstorm really kind of sort of can be a metaphor for the traumatic experience, and as much as the re-experiencing part of it, the sort of the looming effects of trauma. So there's these huge thunderstorms that cover the landscape from early spring into the hot summer months. So, and we know those things happen today as well, right? So how did the buffalo sort of manage these storms, do you think? What did they do when they were confronted by these big, huge, scary things that sort of kind of resemble traumatic experiences? What do you think they did? They huddled together? Did they huddle together and just sort of kind of sit in one place, do you think? No? Do you think they huddled together and ran the other way? Tried to outrun the storm? Which, by the way, one time I did try to do this personally, in my car with my small children in the back on I-90. Don't ever try to do that. Doesn't work. On Buffalo or in car. So what we know, and it's a great metaphor for helping to engage people in engaging in trauma-informed treatment, is what the buffalo taught us is that they huddled together, so they formed a collective, right? Because they know that we're much more likely to survive if we pull all of our resources together and we do this thing as a collective rather than, I myself as a lone buffalo. And what they would do is they would run into the storm, right? And what they know is if they come together and they confronted the storm and they ran right into it, they knew a couple of different things. One is that it's possible and probably even likely that maybe one or two buffalo might get lost, or even a few, but the group as a whole would survive, right? And then they also knew that on the other side of the storm, because it made more sense to confront it and go through it instead of trying to outrun it or go around it. So they knew that on the other side of the storm was calm, brightness, sunshine, peaceful grazing, basically renewal, right? And peace and calmness. And so what we can do is we can use some of these metaphors that we've known or some of these stories that exist in tribal communities, and this is just one of them, to help people to understand that, one, we already have some stories of resilience and survival that we can draw on, which are tremendous sources of strength, right, and healing from traumatic experiences. And two, that we are, that when we do the work together as a collective, when we pull together as groups of individuals, as families, as communities, as nations, and we do this work together, that we're much more likely to survive, and we're much more likely to see a more peaceful outcome, a more happier outcome, right? And I don't know if you can really see this very well, but so this is just intended to signify the calm after the storm. But can you see the generations of people in the water? I don't know if it kind of, you can really see that very well in that slide. So one of the ways that we as Indian Native people, and as both historically but also contemporarily, that we survive our traumatic experiences and we continue to repair and heal is through enduring, through truth-telling and enduring, and working together as collectives. So we endure by acknowledging and telling the truth about what happened to us, either individually, collectively, those kinds of things, and that this is our healing journey. And healing initially happens on a personal level, but it also, beginning with our own tears, right? So when things, horrible things happen to us, one of the cleansing experiences that we have, is we cry, we're sad. Those tears are our medicine, and they're given to us by our Creator. So reminding people that those are biologically, we've been given some tools and some gifts from Creator that help us in this healing journey from the very moments that we have our first assaults, right? Our traumatic experiences. So once the healing begins, it can act like a pebble that's thrown into a pond that actually ripples out and affects our own personal awareness, but also the awareness of our loved ones and our broader communities. And in this way, our truth-telling actually affects not just our own healing, but the healing of everyone. And I really want to encourage you to think about that as you do the work in your own work with individuals and in families, but also the work that you do in your clinics and in your communities, that, if we really want to take a trauma-informed care approach, that we have to remember that individuals are parts of families, and families are parts of communities, and communities are parts of nations, right? And the really interesting thing about traumatic experiences is that no one really escapes it, right? That's the really interesting thing about it, But the meaning that we make of it is embedded in the stories that we make about our lives, right? And that we can really help people to rewrite the stories of their experiences to ones that are focused on positive and positive outcomes and resiliencies, rather than some of the negative things that people come into our clinics with. So anyway, thank you. So I'm going to invite Nimi back up, and we'll be available. Oh, I guess we're all going back up to the panel, so. Okay. Sorry. Thank you.
I just wanted to say Nimi brought us such important basic information about bodies. And if we think of the trauma, it's always in bodies. Stress is always in bodies. And Antony, what a beautiful way to end. Thank you. You were smart to pick the last. All right. So I think I'll go there too.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. A couple of lingering questions then. One is, what is the purpose of pruning in late adolescence, and especially in the prefrontal cortex, and what would be some examples of how that process would benefit function? So the way that we understand the pruning process is, I like to use the analogy of like a highway system or a system of interconnected roadways. So when you're younger, if you think about the relay of information, and that the brain's goal is always to have the most efficient relay of information possible. So when you're young, you have many experiences that are helping to develop those pathways. And then that leads us to which ones are you going to use and retain, and which ones are you going to get rid of. So the pruning process in cutting back what you haven't used is designed to result in a more streamlined information transfer. So if we use the highway analogy, you're on the superhighway then, and information transportation of information is going as fast as it can go and as directly as it can go. So the cost there, the negative, even though that question wasn't quite asked, is that you don't have flexibility. If your roadway's blocked for some reason, you're stuck with that way of getting from one point to the other. Whereas before this pruning process takes place, if one avenue is blocked, you have other ways you can go that may be less efficient. And nowadays, especially for those of us around this campus, I like that analogy because we're dealing with all this road construction all the time. And even like on a day-to-day basis, you never know what pathway you're going to need to go to get from point A to B. And so flexibility is good. So we lose some flexibility in the context of this pruning process. But what we gain theoretically is an increased focus of information transfer, and then we think that translates into more focused, better integrated behavior. So there are pros and cons. The reason for the late pruning, especially in the cortex, is thought to be so that as you're getting older, you can have more experience that will let you use and develop some of those higher level information processing streams. Because when you're a young child, generally speaking, if all is going well, you might have your parents as regulators of your behavior. You might have teachers, the structure of school, but you don't necessarily have contexts that require you to structure your own behavior in the absence of outside influence. So with the prefrontal cortex, the idea is that that window of flexibility is staying open for a longer period of time, so that as an adolescent, you can get out there and have some experiences that will let you yourself direct the course of what sorts of connections you're using and not using. Whereas if you close that window too early, you haven't really had the benefit of using any of those interconnections. So that's the idea there. Another question I got, what, if any, activities or disciplines can help slow the destruction or rewire cells in the hippocampus? So I'm going to reflect over to the talk we heard Nimi give and say that in many ways it's very basic functions, as best we understand what can stop destruction. So exercise is a big thing that's getting a lot of attention in this literature now, with the idea that increases in physical activity are impacting how the brain responds even to stressful events, and so that you can stave off some of the more negative consequences if you engage in physical exercise. Omega-3s are another thing that's been getting attention. And then because a lot of this work is directed within the field of psychiatry, there's also some attention being paid to psychiatric medication, which, again, I know is often viewed as really a last resort in terms of where you want to go with younger people, but it does also help. So we have some very basic kinds of experiences that help to protect the brain, but also some sort of harder core interventions that we can bring to that process.
So we'll collect questions specifically for Nimi or Antony, but for any of the panels, let me just add on to what Monica said. Because the hippocampus connects emotion and thinking and connects past and present, we also found in psychological research that metaphors are very helpful. that we're not only increasing the physicality, the physical functioning of brains, we're also increasing the meaning-making function. And metaphors, particularly in adolescence, seem incredibly helpful because it allows teens to have a way of understanding themselves in ways that are both very useful and accessible. So when we're correcting negative thoughts, we can't just correct, and lots of times you give teens affirmations. You know where your affirmations go? No place. But metaphors, it's a way of really tapping in and enriching that sense of self. So I think that's an important tool for those of us who, can't prescribe omega-3s, but we can remind people about using them. What I loved about Mimi's talk is that she gave it to us in a way that I can say to a teenager, because I'm not his mother, so what do you got against leafy vegetables? And we can talk about that.
And
so
I just want to add,
Go ahead.
omega-3s are over the counter. They're supplement,
That's right.
so you
That's
don't need to prescribe.
That's
Everybody can run out and get their fish oil, their cod liver oil, if you want to go back a few generations.
Also, another factor with the hippocampus in terms of protecting it is to avoid binge drinking and chronic use of marijuana, because they both kill hippocampal cells.
Yeah, it's a lot more easy to convince someone to not smoke pot when you help them know what's happening than to lecture. We know that. All right, so here's a question coming from outstate, Greater Minnesota, sorry. Are there any examples of successful social emotional learning programs in other public settings outside of school?
The research promotes social emotional learning programs delivered in public schools by teachers, so that's been the locus of the research. However, there are some promising practices using some of the social emotional learning curricula that are available out there, particularly some of the mindfulness curricula. There are a number of therapy agencies that are using mindful practices to help their work with adolescents.
I'd say good therapy is social emotional learning. So think about your own practices. I mean, really shift. Think about your practices as how are you promoting social emotional learning? A lot of your outcomes are that. Other questions? Please.
I have a question for Monica and Anthony, and is in the process of pruning, if you think about pruning as cutting out or discarding those synapses that you don't use, how much the culture in which the child and then the adolescent is, if you grow up in a culture where there are spirits and you believe in that interaction, opposite to our European idea in which the physical is all that exists, doesn't that make a difference in the pruning? And what happens to a child in that culture that then we want to fit into a school system that doesn't believe in that?
Excellent question. My first thought is that, as I was thinking about, one of the things that I often think about is like right after doing a presentation about like how I would do it completely different. And now I'm starting to think about how I would completely do it different. Native American sort of philosophy about wellness and well-being is a much more integrative model than is traditionally sort of kind of held in Western perspectives. And that's, of course, there's a lot of sort of, parallels between Native American models and Eastern philosophies and things like that. But how many of you have ever seen the medicine wheel? And so the medicine wheel really talks about sort of like how it's a representation of the whole person, both contemporarily or in contemporaneous times, but also I like the way Don Warren, who's actually a MD and who was actually trained, he's Lakota, he was also trained as a traditional healer. He comes from a long line of traditional healers in his particular family. And one of the things that he talks about is, how intergenerationally, we have this wisdom that we can draw on and this experience that we can draw on from our ancestors in contemporaneous times, right? So it's not something that in the way that Native people would think, is just because, biologically there's something that I prune out, I don't have sort of conscious awareness of some information that's presently here at this moment in time. Native people would say that I have access to those things through other modes because I'm an integrated person. I have access to ancestral knowledge and cell memory and ancestral memory and those kinds of things, and that there's ways of accessing that information that is, I can't go into all that discussion because, one, I'm not trained to necessarily talk about that because I'm not a traditional healer, but I have engaged in ceremony, and the corollary here will be, I'll use a personal experience. I remember one time when I went into a ceremony in a lodge, I was having a very specific traumatic experience in my own life around some stuff, and I was doing some sweat lodge ceremonies and healing. And actually what it was a darkroom ceremony, which is very similar to an Ojibwe ceremony that's very similar to Plains Native sweat lodge ceremony. And I was given, and they shut off the lights and you're in this dark room, and I've never been in one, and somebody thrust a rattle in my hand, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'm supposed to sing. So I'm, the ceremony starts, and I just start sort of kind of following the beat along with the rest of the folks that are part of the ceremony, and meanwhile, I'm starting to have a mini panic attack because I'm like, I don't know the songs, I don't know how to sing them, and I have no idea what I'm going to do. But at some point in time during the ceremony, all of a sudden, I'm singing along with the rest of the people that are engaged in the ceremony, and I don't know how I know the words to the song, but I'm singing the song in time with them, not like a minute later or something like that, like lip syncing mode. So the point is that I think there's something that connects with us ancestrally that helps us to sort of access information that we don't even know that we have. So I think that's a really important thing to think about as well. And then, wellness is really sort of, I think we've all done a really good job of explaining that, which is, the brain, you can think of it as sort of like in the medicine wheel as being the placeholder for the mind. And so in a Native model, we say wellness is really the balance between, an integration between the mind, the spirit, or what we would call ceremony or spiritual or religion, and then the body and emotion, our relational world. And really I think that's a really important approach to thinking about how we help people respond in a resilient way to traumatic experiences, that we really have to access and activate all four of those quadrants, or all four ways of functioning in the world that help us to be well people. Right? Does that make sense?
I actually, this was with regards to when you were talking about metaphor, and it also relates, I think, to the collective sort of experience and ritual and ceremony. I just wanted to point out, because I know a lot hasn't been talked about it today, I'm a creative arts therapist, and I know that also I know we saw art as in a hobby, or we saw that up on there, and I just want to just point out, sort of to make the comment, how important utilization of metaphor and play and ritual and collective experiences in those manners are also extremely healing, and dance. So I just sort of wanted to make that comment because it wasn't talked about much today, and I know it's new and in a way, and there's evidence-based practices happening, and there's research studies, but it also, the utilization of fine arts and creative arts while being sort of facilitated by a master's level clinician or someone who has training in creative arts therapy, it's very important as well.
Well, let's hold it up to our three predictors. And I think if we think of art, there's been a lot of talk this week about creativity, and it goes to Nimi's quiet space. And if art is an activity of the prefrontal, of the consciousness, the emotional consciousness that then gets processed through the prefrontal cortex and organized, it's highly reflective. For adolescents, art is highly agency, right? Dance, moving your body, moving your own experience, creating something that's you. And it tends to be relationship forming because it's shared. So again, I think if we think about why we're using things, then we don't have to defend everything. We can, no, thank you for bringing it up, because I think it really gets to Nimi's point about so much of self-writing, comes from a self-writing within the body. So I think it's a lovely example. I wanted to ask Nimi a question about self-writing, because I thought her experience would help us. If we use the idea of self-writing as the basic sort of core principle, how do we understand medications and how do they work? Because I think a lot of times teens are resistant to be medicated because they don't want to be changed.
So I have to confess my bias up front. I'm very much a proponent of using medication as a very, very last resort, and I use medication very little in my practice. I find that when you really focus on homeostasis, the ability of the body to heal itself in the ways that I talked about, that the majority certainly of young people that come to my clinic for anxiety and depression, even long-standing, and often, honestly, my latest area of focus is the nutrition piece. It's incredible how much healing can happen and how much the stress physiology will shut off without medication. Having said that, I have been humbled every time I think I have the right worldview, then the next patient will come in and teach me otherwise. And it's lovely. But so where I am now is, yes, there's a role for medication, but to be honest with you, a couple of things. You guys already know it's being used far too much with far too little effect. And there was a study that came out in Journal of the American Medical Association, I want to say November 2008, that analyzed all the FDA-sponsored randomized controlled trials of the value of using medication for anxiety and depression. It was in adults predominantly. And what they discovered in this huge meta-analysis of all the studies, is that there's tremendous publication bias. So here we talk about evidence base, and what makes it into our journals are the studies that say, yes, the drug worked. And they found 75 studies, and a full third of them showed no benefit to drug. And doctors, it didn't make it in our journals. So we come away with an impression that we should have a much more robust effect when we prescribe a medication. And the reality is, and we know, and you all know that we don't see those effects. So I would say, again, medication for the child who is so withdrawn, so shut down, that they can't engage in any of the therapies that we've talked about, even the creative arts therapies, the psychotherapies, that's where I think, you really go back to the brainstem therapies, the breathing, the progressive muscle relaxation, because you can engage them at that level. But medication now, I won't prescribe a medication without fish oil. Really robust evidence to show that it improves response and you can use lower medication. So really I see medication as a last resort. Extreme cases, kids who are suicidal. And even there I tell patients and families, this is a temporizing measure. I fully expect that we will be able to wean you off your medication when you're back in balance.
Mm-hmm. I often just use it as a metaphor. I say it's like an antibiotic. It will help you sort of get right enough that you can then take care of yourself. But if you have pneumonia and you keep going out in the winter in a bathing suit, the antibiotic probably won't work.
I wanted to just respond to your question because I think it's an important one when you think about working with adolescents. And if you just think about sort of how this proliferation of social media and just think about my own family members. It's like, practically every teen in my family has made a YouTube video. Some of them I'd rather like to forget, but the point is that I think adolescents by nature are social, and they're also sort of kind of like they want to be creative and they want to sort of kind of tell the story of their lives, and so I think what we can do is we can use things like digital storytelling and these sort of kind of natural propensities to want to be creative to help them tell these stories that are really very interesting and very unique. One of the things I just wanted to draw your attention to was an example of that is, remember a couple of months ago, maybe longer than a couple months ago, Diane Sawyer did a piece on adolescent Native people in Rosebud, or in one of the western reservations in South Dakota. And, and it was, it was interesting, but it was also sort of kind of very stereotypical in terms of like poverty and American Indian kids and some of the challenges that they were having around substance abuse and all kinds of other stuff. What was really interesting was, as a response to that particular piece that was really very proliferated on national television, was a group of Indian Native young people in another setting got together and they made a story about their own experience as adolescent people, and they showed the more positive aspects of who they were. They got together and they did this really amazing YouTube video that just sort of kind of went viral all over the place. And that was their conversation, or their way of sort of kind of restoring who they are. And that's also a really important element that I think we help young people to do, which is engage in agency, engage in creativity, and that they start to be able to name who they are in the world in relationship to others, and rather than having other people name who they are.
I love that word, restoring. I think this question goes to both of you, but I think it's one that we can all think about. How do we increase motivation or desire to heal in youth, specifically very challenged youth? You mentioned Native Americans. This author asked about queer communities when they often report not having a belief in a future. We could have a whole workshop on that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's pretty challenging, especially if you think about queer community, youth who have come from queer communities or other sort of culturally disenfranchised communities, or communities where there's a lot of oppression or microaggressions happening, and the person sort of has to work through those things on a, that can be challenged. Those experiences can be challenging for adults, right? And part of it is my particular orientation and view is that you take the individual back and you help them to understand that that there's a history. And one of the things I do with people is, I did this recently with a couple of kids in a group that I ran. I do this exercise with kids where I tell them about this, to do this exercise called the River of Life. And I tell them, life is like a river. There's sort of kind of a general direction that we're kind of headed in, and there's all kinds of things that can happen in your river. It twists and it turns, and there's points of intersection with other bodies of water and other kinds of things that happen. People enter it and exit it. You have some, rocky moments in your life where the water is really sort of kind of, really challenging to traverse and all those kinds of things. But when you do that thing where you sort of kind of get them to think about, like, what came way upstream, and where are you going, it sort of kind of gets them to sort of kind of step back and take a little bit of a longer view. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I really love about this exercise and working with tribal youth is that, and I've never seen it happen outside of working with Native youth, is that they've actually been able to identify the things that happened before they were born that sort of shaped who they are. Absolutely. So they have this ancestral sort of like historical perspective that they pull on. And you can actually use that as a tool. I think even with queer youth and all kinds of other people, youth from disenfranchised groups, just sort of kind of show them that they're resilient. They're part of a resilient collective that, and there's a purpose for them being here. There's a purpose for, what we don't typically think about is, helping adolescents understand that there's a reason they're here. There's a purpose for them being here. They might not know it, and it may be many years before they know it, but helping them to understand that there's purpose for them is a really helpful and healing experience.
There's two more question clusters, and I hope we can make it. Monica, this would be for you and others, and the person is asking about a kind of conundrum. Research shows that the reward system is hyperactive in adolescents. And other research shows that intrinsic rewards or contingency reinforcement works best with highly enriched, highly successful people. And so so I think a lot of times adolescents can't use extrinsic rewards in a positive way. How can we think about that? Extrinsic, so much is, I'll give you this if you do that, but that's not necessarily tapping into the child's reward system in the brain?
Okay, I don't have an instant answer.
Too bad.
But I think we have to keep in mind that these systems are developing in concert with one another. So the reward system by itself isn't going to be the answer. So when you get to the point where you can bring the executive processes more strongly into play, then that helps to be able to use those extrinsic rewards in a more beneficial way. Okay. So entirely acting in the moment, if you're in a safer context, might be seemingly a good way to operate in your life. But as we've mentioned a few times, adolescents have this tendency to put themselves into more risky contexts, and then that's a problem. So I think you need the executive system to come into play and almost introduce competing sets of goals as that system becomes more developed. So you start to care more about the longer term and balancing the immediate extrinsic rewards with your longer term goals. And then I think, I mean, I'm not sure this entirely gets at the question, but that you're then able to use those extrinsic aspects of the environment more to your longer term advantage, which is what we all want to be able to do. But if you're stuck more, just in the moment and not able to take that longer view, then it becomes more of a challenge, really, for anybody, not just an adolescent. So I think in the sense that these systems are developing, they have to be, somewhat on par with one another to see that real acceleration forward in terms of the positive gain.
All right. The last question is directed to Ed and everyone, and it's a two-part question. It really goes to the activity of telling. If you have teens who, when you ask, they keep saying no, even if you know differently, or if a teen has told his story to a case manager and then his case is moved on, how can we think about the process of telling? How do we help teens feel like telling is a positive experience, and how do we help them hold on to their story? And we have about 1.5 minutes.
Okay.
They're great questions.
And there's a nice challenge. I'll take the second one first. Helping a young person navigate through and hang on to their story can look many different ways, and I think it really comes back to honoring that child in their experience based on their subjective reality. What I do with almost every young person who's an adolescent, I actually have a diagram that I explain to them. Here's where we're going to start. Here's what the middle of therapy looks like, and here's what the end of therapy looks like, and then we celebrate. And I had Mountain Dew floats for the first time ever about a year ago. It sounded terrible. They're fantastic. But they are. Take my word for it. But what I do with some of these young people, and it's very individualized, is I will talk about, and Antony talked about this, and I heard this elsewhere too, about meaning making. An important part of the healing process for a young person is understanding that this is a chapter in their life, this is a rapids on the river, but this is not their entire life. And that the process of healing helps them to integrate this into their river of life, into their lifeline or their timeline of who they are as a whole person holistically. So sometimes we'll start with just kind of, I'll do a lot of psychoeducation around here's what the end of therapy looks like. We're going to help make meaning of this experience or this chronic experience for you. All of my clients get a copy, they get the original copy of their narrative. Now we do some safeguarding around that because it's their story, it's not my story to take. These are written narratives with pictures, with a lot of creative artwork. Young ladies almost always draw the sun and the butterflies, and they're beautiful covers. But underlying that is all of the trauma that we get to. So there's a lot of creativity that the young person brings to their narrative as they develop it over the course of 6 to 18 appointments.
Okay.
on average?
So I've been told to cut it. I'm going to say 4 things really fast. Nimi, in her slide, had a picture of the boy with the cell phone. And certainly cell phones and emails are both risks for adolescents and protections, and we're struggling. On the protective side, if you email the Center for Excellence, I'm sure Judy would forward questions to any of us because she has our emails. So questions that didn't get asked or didn't get answered sufficiently, forward them. The other 2 things I want to say is clearly there are many topics we can have in ongoing lessons. So consider what topics you want, but also please consider being a presenter. Right? We are all in the field. This has been a beautiful discussion of research to practice, and I think we are as successful as a university as any of the athletic teams in making something happen. Thank you, Consortium.
Several things before we close formally. The first thing I'd like to do is thank all of you. We get really excited about this kind of dialogue, and it doesn't happen without you adding your questions and perspectives, and so I really appreciate you being a part of this connection between research and practice. It's what we get really happy about. I also want to thank our presenters for your willingness to be a part of this collaborative presentation and for sharing your life's work with us. Thank you. I also want to thank everybody who helped with today's event, primarily Judy Myers and Jessica Barnes, our staff members who pay attention not only to the big picture needs of these types of training, but to the very fine detail that's required for this type of event. So thank you very much. We have other staff and volunteers who have helped us today. Thank you for your participation. We have technicians who have been videotaping and broadcasting this to over 25 sites around the state. Thank you to all of our participants in Greater Minnesota, and in particular our host site facilitators who do much to make this happen as a statewide event. And then a couple of other notes. You have evaluation forms. Please complete them. If you're here, please give them to the person at the registration desk where you can pick up your CEU forms. If you're in Greater Minnesota, please give them to your host site facilitator. Also, if you're a graduate student, we have a wonderful summer opportunity, and so you can pick up a flyer on the registration table. If you are a social worker, you can go to our website to get your post-test for your CEU credits, and I'm going to give you that address because it's changing. Many of you might have used this site to register for today's event. cyfc.umn.edu is our new website, and within 2 weeks we will migrate all of our content to that site. That again is CYFC. F as in Frank. Yep. cyfc.umn.edu. We are the Children, Youth, and Family Consortium, and that's our website. And there you will find videotapes, handouts, all the information for today's event, plus all of our past lessons from the field events. So if you hear about an event today, we mentioned Karina Walters' presentation, her videotape is there. You can go watch her presentation on historical trauma and all the other materials related to past events. If there were links and resources mentioned today, we'll try to get those linked from our site as well. And last, you have a flyer that looks like this in your folder. Please pay attention to it. These are our plans for next year's events in Lessons from the Field. It also gives our website there, so you can use that. And with that, I will close. We will plan to see you all next year. Thank you.